Chapter 611. The difference in personnel was significant. Only about 40% of the Dragonhawk Legion soldiers met the Star Realm Army standard. And in terms of equipment, the gap was even more pronounced. The infantry divisions might be roughly equal, but the disparity among the armored divisions was huge. An armored division with a large organization, numbering over 30,000 people, might have only two-thirds the heavy equipment of a single Rage Bear Legion's combined brigade. Yet, there were as many as 40 such large armored divisions in the Dragonhawk Legion. Moreover, within their ranks were a few Lion King tanks. By name, these seemed like upgraded versions of the Lion tanks, but in reality, they were completely different. In the Star Realm Army classification, Lion tanks were only considered as standard tanks, while Lion King tanks were bona fide heavy tanks. Their size was 3 times larger than that of the Lion tanks. They possessed extremely thick armor and even had a small, movable shield generator that could protect one side. Its main gun was a super heavy artillery piece, supplemented by 2 secondary guns equivalent to the Lion tanks, as well as 2 heavy explosive machine guns. Nearly 20 crew members were needed inside to operate this tank effectively. The difference was that one Lion King could destroy dozens of lions, the main reason being that its internal gunners and multiple auxiliary targeting servoskulls could operate with very high accuracy. Its main gun, no matter where it hit a lion tank, could inflict devastating damage. The secondary guns could too, they just needed to be more precise. Conversely, lion tanks could hardly inflict effective damage on the Lion King. Even if they managed to bypass the energy shield and surround the Lion King, the weakest parts of its armor, the rearmost or the side track guards, still offered protection far exceeding the frontal armor of an ordinary lion tank. Such heavy monsters could even destroy Night Titans in a head-on conflict. However, these behemoths were few in number within the entire Dragonhawk Legion, averaging less than 1 per armored division. But when General Hans decided to commit, he did so decisively, no longer holding back. 18 of his Lion King heavy tanks, his final ace in the hole, were brought out, half of them dispatched to the most perilous battlefield. At the same time, the armored divisions of the Dragonhawk Legion also began to mobilize. Tactically, they followed the example of the Rage Bear Legion's armored composite brigade. The combat effectiveness of these Dragonhawk armored divisions was far from that of the Rage Bear Legion, but with their number and the support of heavy tanks, they managed to breach the enemy's lines and stabilize the overall defense. The originally teetering second defense line thus became stable. Even the meat grinder situation slowed down considerably afterward. At first, the human side was surprised, but soon, the human military staffers, regaining their wits, figured out the reason. The enemy's losses were also significant. Those plague creatures could also be rendered ineffective. Though the lowest level of plague creatures, such as the plague giant flies or plague zombies, were brainless and possessed no concept of morale, fighting with reckless abandon, it was clear that their commanders, the leaders of the enemy, were not so mindless and would not waste their troops meaninglessly. If they could maintain a destructive assault on the human forces, break through human battle zones directly, then the sacrifice would certainly be worthwhile. However, once the human defensive line stabilized, there was no need for such losses. The most crucial factor was that, during the previous offensive phase, the losses of these plague creatures were actually far greater than those of the human side. Previously, as the human military was in constant retreat, it was difficult to count the enemy's losses. But once the second defense line stabilized and the situation became a stalemate, some estimates could be made. Even though they weren't accurate, they served as a reference. The human casualty exchange ratio with those plague creatures was roughly 1 to 8. This was a high rate, the cost of the enemy's relentless attacks along every sector of the hundreds of kilometers long front line. Humans were initially stunned by the assault, but now they had recovered. Up until now, the battle had been raging for a whole day, and even without counting the plague fly swarms, just the ground forces had nearly 1 million human casualties, while the enemy's losses were estimated to be over 8 million. The demons could no longer sustain the assault. Additionally, there was another objective factor: when the front line reached the human second defensive line, it was already more than 80 kilometers from Pheno City. At this distance, Pheno City could not offer much support. Within Pheno City, the most powerful sinister energy cannon dared not target the ground combat, instead aiming at the sky. The human fleet also flickered in and out of orbit, occasionally unleashing a barrage of fire onto Pheno City, delivering a strike from orbit, declaring their presence in this manner. Although it was difficult to rely solely on a not-so-powerful fleet firepower to destroy Pheno City's void shield, the presence of the fleet still brought significant meaning to the battle. If it weren't for the fleet's diversion, those orbital cannons on Pheno City would level their barrels against the human army's positions, with each shot piercing through effortlessly, leaving no room for negotiation. Moreover, the fleet's orbital strikes could also support the direction of the Plague Demon Army's offensive. It's just that the level of support was not sufficient. When faced with threats from Pheno City's anti-orbit cannons, the fleet could not act too recklessly. Losing a single ship would be unbearably painful. Under such mutual constraints, as the battlefield moved away from Pheno City, the number of conventional sinister energy cannons capable of reaching as far as 80 kilometers away significantly reduced. And those Plague Demon armies, lacking the heavy firepower support from the rear, could not press forward anymore. To continue fighting, on the human-stabilized front lines, under the heavy artillery fire from behind, their losses might not just be as low as 8-1, it could probably double up, if not more. Even the Plague Demon army could not withstand such losses. Pheno City originally had a population of 1 billion, and before the city was completely overrun, 600 million managed to evacuate. Most of the population of Nest Capital, which Pheno City devoured, also fled before being consumed, with just over 100 million swallowed. The Plague Demon army could not possibly transform all these 700 million people into military forces. At least half would be lost in the transformation process. Considering the combined losses and the lack of fire support, the Plague Demon army slowed down their offensive. As a result, the human army could catch their breath. The nearly 20 army groups originally in the first and second defense lines all retreated to the rear, resting under the walls of Minjian City. 15 army groups originally in the rear were now on the front, with dozens more army groups waiting as reserves behind them. Except for the Rage Bear Legion. General Hans did not wish to use such a combat-capable force as a conventional line filler and kept them ready to be redeployed at any moment. With such arrangements, the defense lines were finally completely solidified. However, General Hans still felt unease in his heart. He initiated communication with Gu Hang. "Mr. Gu, although you haven't told me, I know you're preparing something very special," General Hans spoke gravely, a guess he had formed from observing Gu Hang's various actions. "Now, the balanced situation at the front line can't be maintained forever. In fact, by tomorrow, once Pheno City advances 30 kilometers forward, bringing our front line back within their firing range, our pressure will become immense, and we may have to retreat from the second defense line. Whatever plans you have, you need to act quickly." However, in response to General Han's words, Gu Hang only replied, "Now is not the time." Chapter 612. Is it still not time? General Hans was somewhat angry. Then just when do we have to wait? 1,000,000 casualties in a day, 20 army groups need to be rotated out from the front line. My Lord Governor, my Lord Commander of the war zone, do you even understand what that signifies? I've been in the military for 40 years, and I've never fought such a brutal battle. Even in the Golden Pass Star sector, when we were fighting desperately against those greenskins, the scale was larger, but we never lost so many warriors on such a narrow front in a single night and day. Continuing on like this, how long do you think our forces can hold out? Wait until the army corps collapses, wait until Minjian City is also swallowed up, all your myriad and ingenious plans will be meaningless." General Hans unloaded on Gu Hang with a fierce tirade. And Gu Hang, in response, offered only a modicum of consolation. "I understand the heavy sacrifices made by the corps. They are my subjects, my army, am I not saddened, not pained by their sacrifices? But these are all for a greater victory. Do I not even have the right to know about this so-called greater victory? Whether you know or not, has no significance," Gu Hang said, instead making further demands. "I need your troops to do one more thing." "What?" "The next stage of our war mission, is to attack Pheno City." General Hans almost laughed in exasperation. "Do you even realize what you are saying?" "Of course, I do. It can't be done." General Hans decisively refused. "That is an impossible objective." "General Hans, I must remind you," Gu Hang's tone grew stern, "I am not here to discuss combat plans with you, but to issue the most explicit military order." Gu Hang's tone became even more severe, forbidding, "You and your troops must complete the mission of attacking Pheno City within the next 8 days, without delay. Do you understand?" Hans took a deep breath. He was holding in his breath, feeling an urge that wouldn't be satisfied until it was released. But in the end, he held it in anyway. He was a soldier, obedience to orders was his sworn duty. And Gu Hang was now his clear superior. He had no choice but to carry out Gu Hang's orders without question. No matter how much he disagreed, how little he understood. Clenching his teeth, he replied, "Yes, Commander." After the communication ended, Gu Heng stood on the edge of a sheer cliff, gazing down at the battlefield below. The distance was vast, stretching hundreds of kilometers wide and deep, with no end in sight. Yet, despite this, what caught his eye was an immensely majestic scene. All the brutality and cruelty of war, the deaths and severed limbs, the sacrifices and wails, were invisible and inaudible here. All that could be seen was sheer splendor and magnificence. Explosions were the most beautiful fireworks, and the battle line visible in the distance meandered and twisted, changing moment by moment. But none of this stirred any feelings of valiance in Gu Heng. He knew that what Hans had said was true. Countless human warriors were making tremendous sacrifices on the battlefield below. But if one wasn't ready, one simply wasn't ready. At such times, Gu Heng had to be resolute. The unprepared were not his concern. For the past 4 months, the elite troops slated for deployment had been ready and waiting. At the same time, he had long calculated the specific methods of spiritual energy transmission with his own mage core. Gu Heng himself had also immersed himself periodically in his storm god kingdom, working out how to use the divine realm to smuggle through subspace and reach the heart of Pheno City. But he had not forgotten their ultimate goal for this risky venture, to destroy the anti-orbit cannon and void shield at the center of Pheno City. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to reach the target location as soon as possible, which required precise teleportation. At the same time, he hoped that the enemy's defense forces around the target would be as few as possible, which required external pressures so that those demons would draw away the target area's defensive forces to engage the enemy. Of course, having General Han's troops launch a fierce attack on Pheno City to draw the enemy's attention was only a secondary goal. More importantly, when Pheno City came under direct attack, especially as more human warriors entered the activated city, the link between Pheno City, a node overlapping subspace and reality, and subspace would correspondingly weaken. And this would directly affect the extent to which some powerful demons, from the depths of the abyssal hell, could exert influence on the real world. What Gu Heng was most concerned about was the great demon, the Jiwajia demon lord. Clearly, the plague disaster on Karolia planet was a major move by Jiwajia. It had been waiting a long time, already gorged and yet unsatisfied. Its greedy eyes were already set on the hundreds of billions of people in the entire world, unwilling to give up. In fact, it was indeed very close to success. Once it devoured Minjian City, the entire planet would be powerless to resist it. If it sensed any risk of its schemes failing, there was no doubt that it would do everything in its power to prevent it. At first, in Rage Owl Star, Jiwajia couldn't directly traverse the veil of reality, but in Pheno City, it was different. The subspace corruption was too severe here, the veil of reality was already fragile. If it were willing to pay a sufficient price, it could come through. Chapter 613. Currently, we are at this critical point. Gu Heng needs the human military to set foot in Pheno City. It's not necessary for them to accomplish the task of capturing Pheno City, just having enough people step onto it will strengthen the reality veil, as long as the body of Pheno City is set ablaze, creating enough pressure on this living city, it will help reduce the erosion of subspace. This will directly slow down the likelihood of Jiwajia, the Great Unclean One, personally intervening in the battle. Even if it doesn't completely prevent it, the more substantial the cost and the longer the time Jiwajia takes to pass through the reality veil, the more it will directly impact the success rate of the Special Forces mission. This is a key operation to save the lives of 40 billion people on the entire planet, so even though knowing that ordering General Hans to carry out the attack will result in enormous casualties, there is no room for anyone to be soft-hearted at this moment. Of course, besides the sacrifices that ground troops will have to make, Gu Heng also hasn't forgotten the difficulty of their task. It's not as if simply being willing to make the sacrifice guarantees that the troops can break through. Gu Heng also needs to secure some extra help for the ground forces. His options, in reality, are not many. He made contact with Envoy Nell Lavis. "I need more support from the space fleet." This was bound to be a sleepless night, whether for the warriors on the front line holding out against the plague demon army, the second-line troops responsible for transporting logistical supplies, or the combat strategists working through the night on stimulants. No one could sleep this night. The ground troops and the strategists at Central Command had made an all-out offensive combat plan, breaking down the tasks among the subordinate army groups. The army group staff were also at work, and the corresponding tasks were further delegated to division-level units, and so on. On the first day of Mr. Gu's order and the second day since the battle began, the entire defense line remained stationary, continuing with a defensive stance. On this day, the human military didn't face too severe a test, at least, not as severe as the first day of battle. Casualties along the whole defense line were roughly over 200,000. This was still a horrifying number, but it was much better compared to the first day, with casualties of 400,000 within 6 hours, 1 million for the entire day, and the complete rout of more than a dozen army groups. By the third day, the entire defense line was even retreating. However, unlike the first day, this retreat was relatively orderly, a deliberate relinquishment of the position. Furthermore, the troops stationed on the defense line were rotated out for a fresh batch. The main reason for this was that Pheno City had advanced nearly 60 kilometers in these 2 days. Without retreating, the human military's defense line would once again fall within the firing range of many sinister energy cannons deployed within the living city. This was also to avoid the plague demon army, which would start another round of relentless attacks bolstered by more substantial fire support, putting too much pressure on the defense line. This was trading space for time. General Hans also explained his strategy to Mr. Gu: to break into Pheno City, apart from actively attacking to penetrate it, there was another way, which was to wait for Pheno City to come to them. After all, that living city was moving. It advanced 60 kilometers 2 days earlier, while the human military's defense line retreated 50 kilometers. In the following days, the same pattern continued. Pheno City advanced 30 kilometers each day, and the human military's defense line retreated 20 kilometers daily. The reason for this, rather than fiercely holding a single position, was because as Pheno City drew nearer, the pressure on the human military would become greater. Furthermore, after several battles, the forward positions were severely damaged, while the rear positions, newly dug out, were relatively intact, which helped reduce casualties. At the same time, some time was needed for the various units, especially those native defense forces, to adapt better to such brutal battlefield conditions. Of course, this could also result in the total collapse of the native troops' morale. But there was no choice, it had to be done. It was impossible to rely solely on the Dragonhawk Legion's forces for this battle. The native troops numbered over 50 million, and the extent to which they could be effective would have a decisive impact. All that was left was to hope that they would adapt to the battlefield, not completely fall apart. So far, the situation had not progressed in the worst possible direction. At the rate of nearly 10 kilometers a day towards Pheno City, by the dawn of the 7th day, the front line of the human army was less than 30 kilometers away from Pheno City. By then, a large number of sinister energy cannons had entered range, significantly increasing the pressure on the front line. But aside from enduring sinister energy cannon fire, airstrikes, and being severely beaten, the enemy's ground assault was not too frenzied. Up until now, the human army's total casualties had reached nearly 4 million. In general, the human army maintained an exchange rate of at least 1 to 7 against the plague demon army in combat, which meant the plague demon army also suffered losses in the realm of 30 million. Although the majority were plague zombies, wielding the most rudimentary weapons, the consumables required to transform these creatures were significant, not to mention the loss of many powerful flesh monsters in combat, as well as the death of numerous plague wizards, eternal devotees, responsible for creating, controlling, strengthening, and commanding the rank and file, during the battle. This made the enemy somewhat hesitant to continue fighting. It was during this time that General Hans's devastating counterattack began. All the Lion King tanks were committed to battle at once, several armored divisions formed a fist, with many armored brigades from the Rage Bear Legion also participating, initiating an armored cluster thrust in the very center of the battle line. A large number of elite infantry followed closely behind, ready to provide support. And it was at this moment that heavenly fire descended. Almost simultaneously, the starships of the Tianma fleet arrived directly above the battlefield. Among them were even some escort ships and destroyers left by Envoy Lois's tax fleet. Most of the tax fleet had already left the Tianma star sector, having the important task of collecting imperial tax elsewhere. But the few escort ships and destroyers that remained supplemented the firepower of the Tianma fleet. This time, their targets were not limited to suppressing Pheno City. The starships, undaunted by the exchange of fire with anti-orbit cannons, began to apply more pressure on Pheno City, forcing them to divert more of their sinister energy cannons towards the sky for counterattacks and orbital interception. This, in turn, significantly reduced the sinister energy fire that the human armored clusters on the ground had to endure. At the same time, a massive amount of orbital strikes bombarded along the armored cluster's advancement line, conducting intensive bombing. In particular, several shots from L-class heavy cannons caused earth-shattering effects. The results of the bombardment, the number of enemies annihilated, were secondary. The main thing was that the direction of the armored cluster's assault was so bombarded that the enemy was scattered and disoriented. For a while, the ground forces' assault was incredibly smooth. The distance was less than 30 kilometers in total, and by evening, the void shield of Pheno City was within sight. The spearhead forces could even see the artillery fire from starships in the sky, intercepted by sinister energy cannons, or those unintercepted ones causing large ripples as they smashed directly into the void shield. Charge! 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 Long live the 35th Brigade! The forefront unit was a composite camp from the 35th Brigade of the Rage Bear Legion. The 35th Brigade could be considered a meritorious unit of the Alliance. Established early, they had earned their stripes during the Unification War on Rage Owl Star, contributing to the reclamation of the North Territory. Then many of them followed Gu Hang into what was once the domain of the Primal Fury Owl, occupied by the evil god, where they battled storm beasts and ultimately slew the deity. Thereafter, they participated in the war against Blackbird Heavy Industries, which had violated the ban on smart mechanisms. Also, they were part of the first batch of founding forces to be integrated into Rage Bear Legion from the start, arriving early in Karolia to fight and achieving many victories. The unit's honor wall was filled with numerous awards from the central government, Star Realm Army Command, and the Military Affairs Department. And now, this unit of distinction had once again risen to prominence. In the massive battle for Karolia, they took the lead, becoming the first unit to break through the Void Shield and charge into Pheno City. Chapter 614. In the process of the advance, the 35th Brigade experienced losses. Although the orbital strikes had created a path for them, their duration was not particularly long nor the firepower sufficiently intense. The main reason was that Pheno City's anti-orbit cannons had increased their output, shifting their focus away from the attacking ground troops and directing more firepower at the combating starships. This caused significant trouble for the Tianma fleet. Several ships had their void shields and energy shields blown apart, forcing them to retreat urgently. Even worse, 2 escort ships had their shields shattered so suddenly that they could not evacuate from the range of the anti-orbit cannons in time and got hit by several more rounds. Although they didn't explode, the armor was penetrated, resulting in substantial damage to the hulls, and they were heavily damaged. This was exactly the sort of situation the proud naval officers disliked. When Gu Hang made the request, the Tianma fleet was reluctant to comply. Although Gu Hang was the commander of the war zone, the Navy officers' temperament, unlike the stubborn land forces, meant that they would lament, protest, and even escalate issues when faced with what they deemed unreasonable missions. A grand naval decisive battle, perhaps, but to deploy the precious fleet against ground fortresses armed with anti-orbit cannons was downright foolish, like a naval force from the 2000s bombarding coastal defense cannons. However, for the sake of a greater goal, they were ultimately coerced into doing the job. Now, with losses incurred, the 2 ships that had gone to the shipyards for repair might need 2 to 3 years to fix, and the total cost might exceed 2 billion. This loss made the already displeased mood of the Tianma fleet commander even worse. He communicated with the ground forces and Mr. Gu, reporting the issue that continuing the fight in this manner would result in ever-increasing losses. But Mr. Gu insisted they proceed according to the plan. After expressing his strong dissatisfaction, the Navy Rear Admiral could only indignantly state that they would follow the plan at most and could not possibly take on any more. If the fleet suffered more losses, he would decide on his own whether to retreat. If it came to a review by the Military Affairs Department, then so be it. Gu Hang paid him little attention. Issues of attitude aside, completing the task at hand was paramount. The Tianma fleet's deputy commander, who had been left in charge, ultimately dared not fully abandon the battle. Although he refused to take on any more responsibility, he still continued to fire at Pheno City's void shield as the battle plan had outlined, maintaining the suppression. As for the enemies outside the city? Since the battle plan only called for 1 round of orbital bombardment, why fire a second round? Besides, the armored units on the ground had already begun their advance through the blasted zone. What was the point of continuing bombardment? And as for providing covering fire for the enemies near the advancing route, the operation plan specified that this task was to be carried out by 2 destroyers and 6 escort ships, yet the number of ships that had withdrawn from the battle sequence due to shattered shields had already exceeded this. Therefore, the inability to assist was normal, and surely not a naval issue. In light of the Navy's somewhat weak support, the land forces' offensive naturally could not proceed smoothly forever. If the orbital bombardment was only for one round, not every inch of the ground could be covered. Even if it were, there would be survivors at the edge of the explosions, inside defensive structures, or simply those lucky enough to remain alive. After the bombardment, the plague demon army, which had not been covered by the orbital firepower, also hurried to support from all directions. All these factors greatly hindered the route of the human armored forces. But despite these challenges, the armored group's progress was still rapid. The hastily assembled forces that attempted to block their way rarely received support from Pheno City's sinister energy cannons and were relatively scattered and rushed. Under the iron tide, these obstructing monsters were mercilessly crushed. After paying a certain price, the 35th Brigade became the first army to breach Pheno City's void shield. And as their boots, wheels, and tracks stamped across a mass of writhing flesh, the most arduous part of the battle commenced. Their forces carried with them ample specialized weapons. Incendiary rounds, flamethrowers. As the troops moved forward, they burned the surface every step of the way, incinerating the living flesh, forcing it back, revealing the grey concrete underneath, with exposed steel rebar in some places. They used artillery, tank cannons, machine guns, and even threw bombs into the fleshy buildings beside them, smashing and collapsing them. The goal was to eliminate any potential enemies inside these flesh structures as well as to destroy the flesh itself. However, after the 35th Brigade's large-scale entry into Pheno City, the rate at which the living city advanced slowed significantly. Yet, it was then that immense numbers of the plague demon army surged from all directions, willing to sacrifice their flesh and blood in a siege against the human forces, determined to slow their advance. Swarms of giant flies circled above the battlefield, braving the anti-aircraft fire from vehicles and infantry to perform dive-bombing suicide attacks. Chapter 615. Even a corrupt magic dragon had flown to the battlefield. With a great breath, it sprayed a lion tank for several seconds, causing flesh buds to grow on the armor during those seconds. The tank was paralyzed, half flesh, half steel, unable to move, and the soldiers inside perished as a result. The casualties borne by the 35th Brigade began to escalate at an alarming rate. Yet, there was nothing that could halt their advance. Brigade Commander. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Company on our flank has been breached, and the Artillery Battalion has been ambushed by a group of demons. The Tank Battalion reports a loss of 60% of their combat vehicles. The Anti-Air Battalion has been attacked by that magic dragon again, and our anti-air interception capability has dropped by 70%. The vehicle of the Commissar who was overseeing the Anti-Air Battalion has been destroyed, and we've lost contact with him. The 4th Battalion has lost all contact, we can't reach any of their companies. It's possible they've encountered jamming entities, but a complete annihilation cannot be ruled out. All Colonel Jakov, the commander of the 35th Brigade, heard was bad news. By conventional wisdom, the entire brigade was at the end of its rope by now. But there was not a hint of hesitation in his eyes. He grabbed the communicator, switched to the all-unit channel, and began to speak. Comrades of the 35th Brigade, this is your brigade commander Jakov. Now is the time to prove our loyalty. I order all units to advance at all costs. The brigade headquarters move forward at full speed, from the command post to the guard battalion, support the front line with all your might. We must do everything in our power, at any cost, to ensure that the breach we've opened is wide enough. For the Empire. For humanity. For the Alliance. Advance, advance, advance. The Chief of Staff beside him widened his eyes as he looked at Jakov. After he put down the communicator, he said bitterly, our 35th Brigade will be finished, we'll all die here. But Jakov just smiled, then let us die with honor, and die great. Drive. These 2 words were addressed to the driver. The command vehicle, with the throttle fully opened, along with the entire command post and the guard battalion, began to press forward. Following the commander's orders, the 2 guard companies joined the front line in their infantry fighting vehicles, while the guardsmen on foot filled in the excessive losses of the front line infantry. The 35th Brigade's strength was rapidly diminishing, and even as their objective combat power declined, the speed of their attrition quickened due to maintaining the offense. However, no matter what, they were indeed still fighting forward. In the depths of the writhing nest capital Pheno City, within a huge flesh nest, Tomlinson was looking up at a wriggling wall. Projected upon it was the ongoing offensive of the 35th Brigade. His body no longer bore the frailty of humanity. Blessed, he stood 3 meters tall, swollen and powerful. His body, sheathed in robes, twitched from time to time. Only his eyes remained firm and piercing. Watching the projected images, his body heaved restlessly. He, Tomlinson, was the current leader of the sublimation sect, an apostle of the great demon, a spreader of the Corollia plague, a recipient of the blessing. He had long forgotten the many years ago when, as a human warrior handed over as imperial tax, he was conscripted into the Star Realm army after surviving countless battles. But today, watching those impassioned warriors, advancing despite the grievous casualties, the dusty years of glory emerged once more in his mind. But these resurfacing memories did not evoke nostalgia, instead, they fueled his rage even more. And even if he set aside the anger in his heart, just considering the war situation, he knew he couldn't let this unit keep charging forward like this. The breach inside Pheno City was being torn wider and wider. The deeper this human force charged, the easier it would be for more human armies to enter Pheno City. They were destroying the body of Pheno City, forcing the living nest capital to divert more of its strength to repair itself. This would lead to a weakening of subspace power. At the moment, Pheno City had come to a complete halt. Indeed, according to the current situation, that human force should have been annihilated by now. But in fact, this should have happened an hour ago. Eradicate them, Tomlinson spoke, let the magic dragons go down, send the Father's beloved hounds, release the blessed ones. You must destroy them for me. After destroying them, you must drive all the enemies out of our city along this road. As you command, messenger. Within this fleshly nest, another voice echoed. Not long after, Tomlinson saw a change in the battlefield scene. Several different units appeared on the battlefield. The so-called Father's loving dogs referred to the rotting flesh beasts, monstrous creatures of sickly and extreme ugliness, with their lower halves resembling long, wriggling maggots, their upper halves rose high, with a giant mouth opening in the belly, and limbs beside the maw that aided in movement and in seizing prey to feed. Their upper limbs were in the form of powerful arms. The so-called blessed ones were known to humans as chaos spawn. These entities stood 2 to 3 meters in height, roughly humanoid in shape but completely twisted beyond recognition. They were the result of humans undergoing a mutation after receiving, yet failing to endure, the blessings of gods. 5 or 6 behemoths, accompanied by dozens of chaos spawn, appeared at the front lines, immediately causing a direct shift in the tide of battle. The chaos spawn couldn't withstand tank shells, but bullets were largely ineffective against them. Once they charged and got close, they could flip over armored vehicles with their physical strength. The rotting flesh beasts could even take direct hits from tank shells, with chunks of their bodies being blown off, spraying flesh and blood yet not fatal. Their writhing flesh would quickly regrow. The corrosive pus spewed from their giant maws could melt tanks. Brigade 35, resolute as their fighting spirit was, finally couldn't advance any further under such resistance. And the demon dragon in the sky, at that moment, dived directly. Sustaining some damage from anti-aircraft fire, it nonetheless destroyed 2 anti-aircraft vehicles with its breath. After landing, its position was not far from Colonel Jakov's command vehicle. It had already set its sights on it. Confronted by the approaching demon dragon, Jakov's command vehicle was fearless, its only mounted weapon a heavy bomb gun continuously firing at the demon dragon. Even with heavy bombs and without the plague fly swarm from Yunrao for cover, the dragon's rotting body was blasted, flesh flying everywhere. Yet it still rapidly charged beside the command vehicle, flipping it over with one sweep, then with ferocious claws, it struck 7 or 8 times, smashing the entire command vehicle to pieces. After venting its rage, the demon dragon roared towards the sky with insolent pride. But just as the roar had not yet ended, a heavy cannonball struck its head, blowing it off. Tomlinson saw it all clearly, this was certainly not a simple human artillery or tank shell. The projected image panned out, and he saw a steel beast with a smoking barrel in the distance. It was a Lion King tank. Following the opening created by Brigade 35, the armored contingent of the human army finally had its main forces arrive. Its 2 secondary cannons were also firing, and the main cannon that had just delivered a fatal blow was once again charging. The next shell blasted another rotting flesh beast to ruin. Tomlinson's voice was deep as he ordered, "We must hold back these humans, send more troops forward. Send more troops forward. We must not let Brigade 35's sacrifice be in vain." Lee Kexi shouted loudly. He had been appointed the frontline commander for this armored advance, and was currently issuing orders to his staff. His face was intensely flushed, pained by the sacrifice of Brigade 35. But pain did not prevent him from seizing this opportunity with all his might. After issuing the orders, he ran some calculations and dialed an encrypted communication frequency. Mr. Gu, 15 divisions have entered Pheno City, reaching the target you expected. Following that, I'm confident that within an hour, another 15 divisions can join, including some infantry divisions, amounting to over 300,000 troops. Good, you all have worked hard, Mr. Gu's voice arrived shortly after, you must maintain the offensive. I understand. Li Kexi replied, and then hesitantly asked, we have made huge sacrifices, victory must be ours in the end, right? I assure you. Chapter 616. You all can see, without any need for me to say it, countless Imperial warriors are fighting bravely on the battlefield below. Our armored units, after making tremendous sacrifices, have already charged into Pheno City, this den of evil. They will continue to assault it until their last breath. This is an offensive filled with despair. Many commanders among them understand that their attack doesn't carry much significance, that they cannot possibly succeed, yet it is also an offensive brimming with passion and boundless loyalty. Precisely because they know this, their greatness and loyalty are even more pronounced when they offer up their lives amidst blood and fire. And all that they do for us. Every one of you is the elite of the elite, the shining brilliance of humanity. It is precisely for this reason that you must never forget the millions of Imperial foundations who have sacrificed themselves in this war. Carry them in your heart, take their will with you, and execute our mission. I have already promised the front-line commanders that the ultimate victory will be ours. Now, I need you to promise me, will victory truly be ours? Gu Heng was giving his final address to the troops who were about to participate in the action. In front of him stood about 600, no more than 700 people. The largest contingent was a group of 300 elite soldiers from the 10th Brigade. Half of them were equipped with standard exoskeleton armor, hand-picked from within the brigade. The other half, a special formation of 150 people from the 10th Brigade Fang Camp. What set them apart from other units of the 10th Brigade was that all of them were equipped with a Servant God type feedback type power armor. Unlike the Demon Hunter's silver-gray coating, the Fang members' paint job was mainly bright yellow with some orange accents. The next three contingents each numbered 100 people. 100 spiritual energy wielders from the Storm Mage Corps, all equipped with exoskeletons to assist their movements. Their leader, Mrs. Deers, had a feedback-type power armor painted sky blue. The most up-to-date noves are published on Fruit Noello. 100 interstellar warriors from the Phoenix Battle Group also were present. There were also 100 battle nuns from the Holy Benevolence Lily. Beyond these 600 people, there were also 12 Ranger-type Night Mechas and 4 Warhound-class Titans. The drivers, together, added up to 60 people. Adding Gu Heng himself, the total number of participants was 661. These people were listening to Mr. Gu's pre-battle mobilization speech. Among them, even the veterans were moved by his words. The 4-century-old veterans from Phoenix were fine, without a word, they fully understood what they had to do. As for the battle nuns from Holy Benevolence Lily, many of them had decades of combat experience. On any other battlefield, they might not have been so stirred. But now they were in Karolia, on their own home soil. Seeing so many people, including Karolia people and those who had come from other planets to support them, making huge sacrifices to save this world, they had long been filled with the will to fight. At this moment, that will was further ignited. If this applied to them, it was even more so for the new recruits. Some of the more emotionally expressive warriors even began to shout. Victory belongs to us. For the Emperor. For humanity. For Karolia. For humanity. The shouts were not uniform, they had never rehearsed such a thing beforehand, but there was no doubt that they expressed their emotions and attitudes. Gu Heng showed a smile. Then let's move out. Gu Heng issued the order to move out. At this moment, nearly a day had passed since that conversation with Li Kexi. According to Li Kexi, he could transport the equivalent of 30 divisions into Pheno City within an hour. He did it. And what he did was even more than that. Not just 30 armored divisions, they had torn a sufficiently large hole into Pheno City and struck multiple gaps from other directions. And after the front-line forces had advanced deep enough, a large number of infantry units also followed suit. At least 20 infantry masters entered Pheno City. They were already moving with the armored units, so as soon as the opportunity arose, they desperately surged in. Moreover, their assault was not just limited to the ground. The initial area they attacked was only the surface of Nest Capital. They dared not dig down, but they were bold enough to strike upwards. The living nest capital had undergone significant changes, and the distributed maps of nest capital were not much useful. The armored units found it hard to find a way up. But for the infantry corps, finding the way up was not so difficult. Currently, over 1 million human troops had been deployed into the nest capital of Pheno City. And they discovered that pushing the front lines into Pheno City had another advantage: the sinister energy cannon fire they endured became less. Likewise, they were also less likely to suffer aerial attacks. Those heavy cannons were clearly not easy to reposition and fire within the city. Although nest capital had significantly changed, many areas were still defined, and the circling dragons, as well as the plague fly swarm, couldn't strike from the air anytime and anywhere. Of course, disadvantages also existed. Inside the flesh body of Pheno City, small but very maliciously placed sinister energy cannons occasionally emerged from a mass of flesh beside them, unleashing sudden attacks on human forces. Chapter 617. At the same time, as they penetrated deeper, the enemy's movements became increasingly elusive. Wherever the flesh and blood structures or the ground had not been cleansed and were imbued with activity, a cavity door might open at any moment, and plague demons would emerge, causing significant casualties to the human forces. Equally troubling was the indication that routes blasted by the orbital cannons and then stormed by armored troops were starting to get resealed. There seemed to be signs that the plague demon army planned to break through the human forces' rearguard, trapping them within the city before beginning an encirclement and elimination campaign. As it stood, unless they abandoned the assault and promptly withdrew their forces, the human military had no other means to counter the situation. The main demon army outside the city had not been annihilated, merely a direct passage had been blasted through them. This passage was flanked by battle lines stretching tens of kilometers in depth on both sides. The troops responsible for maintaining the human military's rear simply could not withstand the pincer attack coming from the enemy. Even within Pheno City, the human forces could no longer sustain the vigorous offensive they had launched the previous day. They shifted to hunkering down on the spot, and it was already commendable if they could maintain the positions they had secured. The situation had reached a critical point. However, at the same time, Gu Hang believed the moment to strike the final blow had ripened. In fact, having 300 to 500,000 human troops within Pheno City was already enough to meet his requirements. The current situation was even more than twice as favorable as the one he had originally hoped for. This granted him and his subordinates with spiritual energy a significant margin for error. The storm mages, prepared in advance, swiftly formed an array around everyone just as they had practiced over the previous months. At the very heart of the array stood Dress. Her spatial spiritual energy talent would play a central role in the entirety of the endeavor. This was a primer for opening a spatial gateway. And if it were simply a matter of conventional teleportation, why the necessity for the prelude of millions of brave soldiers' blood? Gu Hang, floating above Dress, was in fact the mastermind behind this transit, an incursion involving the teleportation of hundreds over a mere distance of slightly more than 200 kilometers. The entire teleportation array was under his control. And he, discreetly opened a subspace rift. This rift, of course, connected to his storm god kingdom. The next moment, a deep blue radiance enveloped all the people above the array. Over 600 people, along with numerous heavy machines, disappeared from their original location in an instant. Many among them were experiencing teleportation for the first time and thus found everything to be normal. Their nervousness was simply due to the unfamiliarity and the previous warning about certain safety risks of teleportation, added to the arduous task that lay ahead. But, at the same time, there were quite a few among them who had been through teleportation before. Like Mrs. Georgette. She sensed that the spiritual energy teleportation this time was somehow different from the experiences she had been through on other battlefields in the past. Previously, point-to-point teleportation in the real world was almost instantaneous, a sensation of dizziness followed by a blinding white light that obscured everything. After that, it would be over, and they should have arrived at their destination. If lucky, there were no enemies nearby, and the teleport team could have time to organize their gear, deploy their formation, and ascertain their precise location. Teleportation had its variances. If unlucky, they might land right amidst the enemy, which was still relatively fortunate as they could simply fight chaotically with a debuff of dizziness and disorientation. After all, they were teleported for that very purpose, and it's not like the ambushed enemy would be in any better shape. The worst-case scenario was being teleported into a stone. Half of the body inside, and half outside. That would be fatal literally. The spatial power of the teleportation would push aside the entities in that area, whether it was air or other substances, to place the teleportee there. Pushing aside air was akin to a gust of wind, but forcefully pushing aside something else under high pressure often caused fatal injuries to the person who was halfway or fully immersed. Even if they survived the damage, it was quite common to be stuck and unable to get out. However, this risk was low as the teleporters would eliminate it as much as possible, just like they would try to make the teleportation more accurate. As for accidents, accidents were a part of spiritual energy teleportation. What could one do? But the difference this time was that the feeling of dizziness was much more intense. It was even worse than when teleportation malfunctions occurred over distances of thousands of kilometers. Moreover, the intense light before their eyes was not white, but blue. And crucially, she did not feel that she had reached her destination but was stuck in some environment. The blue light, not even blocked by closed eyes, prevented her from seeing her surroundings. She only felt her body floating. She seemed to have heard the sound of lightning as well. Her dizzy, nauseous state was rapidly easing, but her heart was becoming more and more panicked. Could there have been a teleportation accident? Of course, this was no teleportation accident, but rather Gu Hang's doing. At this moment, everyone was within his storm god kingdom. This place was already in subspace, and also the springboard he intended to use. The plague demon sword that had been purified was now firmly grasped in his hand. With the demon sword in hand, he swung forcefully, tearing open a rift in the space before him, and the space filled with evil. The rotten smell was just beyond this spatial crack. Although extremely unpleasant, this force did not show any hostility, nor did it backfire. At this stage, Gu Hang's heart finally settled. Although, according to previous calculations and estimates, the outcome should be just like this without a doubt, he still felt a lingering trepidation as there had been no conditions for experimenting. And now, his conjectures had turned into reality. The subspace surrounding and eroding Karolia belonged to Ge-Wajia, the Great Unclean One. And the power source of the demon sword in his hand was as well, an incarnation of Ge-Wajia. And by using this holy instrument to touch this piece of subspace, there would be no counterattack. Next, Gu Hang enveloped everyone with his own power, and continued the teleportation, crossing through the split created by the demon sword, arriving at the subspace area closest to Pheno City. Though it was still subspace, the environment here was drastically different from the Storm God Kingdom. A thick green aura wafted through the place, and within each inch of air, it seemed there were countless tiny organisms. They were content, they were unruly, they had received a promise from some great existence, ensuring they would exist forever and could do whatever they desired. And these drifting tiny organisms had no intelligence. The only thing they wanted to do was to proliferate, and proliferate some more. And the human body intruding this subspace was apparently the best carrier for their reproduction. Their instincts drove them to eagerly try to enter the human body through any available means: breathing passages, skin, exposed mucous membranes, and the like. But they were kept at bay by a force that was of the same origin as them, but much more powerful. They could only wilt away where they were. That force belonged to the master of this space. Gu Hang, who was not rejected, was still very cautious. He quickly followed a pre-calculated route, wrapping everyone with the power of spiritual energy, and arrived at the core area of Pheno City. From subspace, they had come to Pheno City. This might sound unbelievable, but in fact, it was quite simple. The reason Pheno City had revived was precisely that the entire city had been completely covered by subspace rules, or to say, the whole city had been dragged into subspace and became a part of it. The whole of Pheno City possessed a dual overlap state of the real world and subspace. The closer to the edges of Pheno City, the weaker this overlapping state would be, and reality's veil could still play a certain role, but the closer to the core, the more solid the overlap of the two. At the very heart, they were simply one and the same. And the target of Gu Hang and his group was precisely at the core of Pheno City. Here was the cause of the city's revitalization. At the same time, the wicked void shield and dark energy anti-orbit cannon that protected the revitalized city in the real world, drew their powers from this very place. To destroy these, they had to come here. And now, they had arrived. Ge-Wajia made no reaction to this, and the subspace here showed no rejection to their arrival. Utilizing the demon sword, sharing the same origin as Ge-Wajia himself, to deceive the subspace for the smuggling plan, it could be said to be half successful already. Chapter 618. Normally, arriving at Pheno City in this manner would be impossible. This place is saturated with Ge-Wajia's power, and due to its presence in subspace, it would manifest here in its complete form. Defeating a great demon within its own domain is an almost impossible task. The Jiwajia here is even more ferocious than the god-titled primal fury owl that Gu Heng had encountered, the strongest individual he had ever faced. Over the past 4 years, Gu Heng's experience had gradually filled up, and he was fortunate to have a generous number of favor points, so he had already increased his psychic level to 8. However, according to the data shared by the Psychic Cultivators Association, his strength as a level 8 psychic still ranked within the grade A psychic level in the association's classification. He would likely need to reach level 9 to match the strength of a grade S psychic. This was even considering he had various talent bonuses and event modifiers. If it were for heroes Gu Heng had activated, like Dress, they would probably need to reach level 10 to have the strength of a grade S psychic. Of course, if Gu Heng were to tear open the gate to subspace and imbue himself with the power of the Storm God Kingdom, then his psychic strength could instantly reach grade S, or even surpass it. But even so, Gu Heng didn't feel that this level of power would be sufficient to defeat a great unclean one within subspace. Unless he had a variety of advantages like when he fought the primal fury owl, such as Jiwajia being stuck between the veil of reality and subspace, or if Gu Heng could have an army under his command to gang up on the great demon. Clearly, none of these options were possible. Thus, the only chance of victory was to keep Jiwajia out of the mix. At least until they achieved their objective. Using the demonic sword left behind by Jiwajia's avatar after it was destroyed, they successfully overcame the first wave of difficulties. Jiwajia had no reaction. That was to be expected. This subspace belonged to Jiwajia, his power and presence were everywhere. What was so special about the demonic sword? The mage corps led by Gu Heng thus successfully completed the teleportation and arrived in the core area of Pheno City, a place where the veil of reality no longer existed, and Pheno City was fully overlaid with subspace at its core. Even the demons entrenched here had no reaction to the uninvited guests brought by Gu Heng. Until, the bullets of human warriors descended upon their heads. Where did they come from? Tomlinson felt utterly bewildered and shocked. He immediately thought of psychic teleportation as the method used. Only this power could allow an army to appear out of nowhere, ignoring physical distances. Yet, psychic teleportation could break through physical distances but not subspace distances, or rather, it was not supposed to be so easy or happen without anyone noticing. In truth, to prevent such a situation, the core area of Pheno City had preparations against psychic teleportation. Completely blocking it was difficult, but with jamming devices in place, unless the teleporting psychic was extraordinarily strong, they could easily be diverted to the outside, and given the presence of subspace, even if an enemy managed a precise teleport, they could at most appear on the outskirts of the core area. If someone really did manage that, they would run headlong into their tightest defenses. Moreover, an alarm system Tomlinson had installed would alert him the moment an enemy initiated a psychic traversal. But none of these preparations had any effect. The enemy simply appeared directly in front of him. And the strength of the incoming foes was somewhat outrageous. The images projected onto the flesh wall before him were severely disrupted by psychic interference. Still, he could see several renowned figures flickering in the unstable image. Interstellar warriors, battle nuns, mecha knights, and even titans. What in the world? Why were there so many things in Karolia? Apart from the battle nun whose lair was in Karolia, where did the rest come from? Even in his current, utterly formless state, he was severely startled. Order all the perimeter defense troops to immediately. Tomlinson's muffled voice had just begun when a loud explosion was heard. The projection in front of him went completely dark, the flesh wall was blown to smithereens, exposing a large hole. Tomlinson's reaction was swift. His filthy, grotesque, enormous body suddenly caved inwards, forming a cavity. A thick fog erupted from within, precisely enveloping the 2 phoenixes who had burst through the shattered opening. The evil power rapidly corroded the Tau steel armor on the phoenixes. The 2 phoenixes experienced extreme pain. Despite this, they persevered in raising their bomb guns and firing at the horrifying, massive lump of rotten flesh entrenched in the core nest before them. In an instant, at least a dozen bombs hit Tomlinson, flesh flying everywhere. However, these injuries meant nothing to Tomlinson, who was akin to a mountain of flesh. The 2 phoenixes could no longer hold on, they died a brutal death under the virulent poison, their powered armor corroded and pitted. Even Tau steel could not withstand such vile dark magic. Chapter 619. Tomlinson felt slightly relieved. He didn't count on a cloud of poisonous fog to completely seal off the humans' assault, but as long as it could buy some time, that would be enough. Just a little bit longer and the elites guarding outside the core nest would have time to fall back to defense earlier. The sacrifice of the two phoenixes pained Gu Heng quite a bit. Despite knowing that this operation wouldn't be easy and that sacrifices were inevitable, it still hurt all the same. After all, training one was no easy feat. Moreover, the sacrifice of these two provided intelligence on what lay ahead. Georgette, Maddens, and Rizzo discussed among themselves and decided to make another joint assault. Maddens was protected by more solid Terminator power armor, Rizzo and Georgette, on the other hand, were under the Divine Emperor's protection. Moreover, the spiritual energy wielders in the back could also provide them with additional protection. With these multiple methods, the risk should be greatly reduced. However, just then, Gu Heng's voice rang out, "Let me do it." The three were stunned and immediately wanted to dissuade him. But they were all stopped by Gu Heng's extended hand. He was the highest commander, and he had the final say in everything here. Gu Heng didn't truly have any quirks about risking his own life. But the most critical aspect of this operation was speed. He wanted to deploy full force without any delay. The later the end time, the greater the sacrifice, and even the possibility of Ge Wajia arriving would increase. He headed straight for the cave entrance. Upon entering the range of the poison fog, his protective spiritual energy was immediately activated. The vicious dark magic clashed fiercely with his spiritual energy. At the same time, he also detected a huge tentacle shooting towards him. Gu Heng remained calm, his eyes glowing blue, and spiritual energy surged from within him. As a whirlwind swept through, the poisonous fog was quickly dispersed. At the same time, the huge tentacle was locked in place by an invisible telekinesis, stopping in its tracks at least 20 meters away from Gu Heng. Maddens and the others at the cave entrance noticed the dispersal of the poisonous fog and immediately charged inside. They came in weapons raised, ready to unleash a ferocious attack upon the enemy straight away. However, what they saw left them dumbfounded. First, the opponent they had to face was a surprise, the strange, mountainous flesh enemy, from which emanated a stench so foul that even through the life support helmets, it was barely tolerable and extremely discomforting. Next, its current state was astonishing. It was trembling, convulsing. Many arcs of electricity still flashed intermittently across the mountain of flesh. And Governor Gu, floating in front of the flesh mountain, raised his right hand high, gathering the arc into a massive spear of lightning. Then, this spear of lightning, like divine retribution, was hurled by Gu Heng, striking the flesh mountain in front of him. The creature reacted as if it had been hit by a ship's cannon, a vast hole appearing in its body. Rotten flesh writhed, attempting to heal the wound, but the continuous arcs of electricity hindered regeneration. The struck flesh mountain was unable to perform any action, merely convulsing there, taking hits for free, not at all reflecting the quick response it had when the wall of flesh was first blasted out of the cave entrance. Lightning paralyzed its body, spiritual energy gripped its soul. Of course, that left it no choice but to passively take the beating. This was already the second lightning spear Gu Heng had launched. And the third was already forming in his hands. By that time, the warriors who had rushed in had finally come to their senses and began to assist their governor in the attack. It's no wonder they had been stunned at first. The power of the lightning spear in Gu Heng's hands was incredibly fierce and frightening. At the end of the day, whether they assisted or not didn't seem to make much of a difference. The little wounds they could inflict with their grenade guns paled in comparison to the governor's lightning spears. Of course, they could get closer and try with powered swords, holy gold halberds, or gravity scepters. But, there was no need. Mr. Gu was launching a lightning spear in just a few breaths, each one like a massive cannon. They simply didn't need to intervene. Better to follow the plan and set up a defensive line on the side. Commanders did as such, swiftly moving the warriors inside and establishing a defense. Yet, while busying themselves, they couldn't help but be drawn by the thunderous booms and inadvertently glance toward the center. The flesh mountain had been leveled after Mr. Gu's 19 strikes. Such a display of might inspired awe in all present. Even among the veterans of the interstellar warriors, and the experienced battle nuns, it was the same feeling. Was this the power of an A-tier spiritual energy user? The A-tier spiritual energy users they had seen before weren't this formidable. Perhaps those A-tier users could perform similar strength attacks, but they definitely wouldn't be able to launch 19 in a row without even seeming to breathe hard. Mr. Gu was, a bit excessively fierce. At this moment, the governor was floating in the very center of the nest, the blue light in his eyes not fading in the slightest but shining even more brightly. His voice appeared in everyone's ears. I have located the demon engine that maintains the Wicked Void Shield, as well as the positions of 9L layer Wicked Energy Railguns. Chapter 620. Commander Maddens, I grant you full command. Please lead Team A to destroy the demon engine. Afterward, you may divide your forces, split into groups, or act together to destroy as many sinister energy cannons as possible. But remember, you must return here within 3 hours. The rest of you, stay and fortify this location, under the command of General Naves, ensuring nothing goes wrong. Dress in the Storm Mage Corps, please start establishing the transportation channel immediately. We will leave this place in 3 hours. Yes. Commander Madden stood up, swiftly mustered Team A, and set out. The so-called Team A was a team that had been put together before the action, consisting of about 2/3 of the entire group's personnel, excluding the spiritual energy users. The remaining personnel also went about their assigned duties, doing as the Governor-General had ordered. With time pressing, no one could afford the slightest relaxation at this moment. Among them, the busiest person was none other than Gu Hang. He assigned tasks and duties to all his subordinates, getting everyone busy. As for himself, he had to deal with a task of utmost importance: blocking Ge Wajia with all his might. Of course, Ge Wajia probably hadn't noticed the commotion here yet. This was precisely why Gu Hang had chosen to strike this place first. He had long realized that the meat mountain he had just leveled was actually a spokesperson for Ge Wajia, a messenger of Ge Wajia, the core maintaining the overlay of Pheno City with the subspace, an extension of Ge Wajia's power into the real world. But killing it didn't mean everything was over. Pheno City was already beyond salvation. The issue couldn't be resolved just by killing a cult leader or a great demon's messenger. The core area of Pheno City had been completely dragged into the subspace. The crux of the problem lay in the subspace, in Ge Wajia, not in whoever outside was maintaining the erosion of subspace. What good would killing this monster do? If Ge Wajia noticed, it could select another person at any time to perform a similar role. In fact, if necessary, its very entity could descend. The problem would remain unresolved. However, the key point was that whether Ge Wajia decided to find a new spokesperson after discovering the issue, or to descend itself, all this would take time. The temporary disruption of the core, as well as Gu Hang's use of his spiritual energy and the demon sword to block this place, severed the interaction between the two worlds. Since the demon sword's essence was Ge Wajia's power itself, it would make it difficult for that filthy entity to detect the problem immediately. His current task was to make this unobtrusive isolation last as long as possible. Yet such isolation couldn't last forever. Given time, Ge Wajia would ultimately discover it. And what Gu Hang needed was precisely this time difference. The following is free. Regarding updates, I'd like to say a few words to everyone. I also wish to write more, but honestly, writing is slow. 4,000 words take me about 2 hours. Moreover, the further I get into the story, with more characters and events, the more difficult it gets to manage. Sometimes before I start typing, I need to use pen and paper to sketch some thoughts, as it's my personal habit for thinking. One session can easily take up half an hour, covering 1 or 2 pages. Plus, since I'm not a full-time writer, my time is really limited. I can only work hard to maintain a daily update of 4,000 words, ensuring a full attendance each month. As for why I'm doing single updates rather than splitting them into 2 chapters, it's mainly because writing flows better this way, and it also reads more smoothly in one go. Forcing it into 2 chapters would disrupt the rhythm. I'll try hard to get 6,000 done tomorrow. Chapter 621. Gu Hang's actions at this moment were all for the purpose of creating a larger window of opportunity for Team A's mission. The core of their mission was still to destroy the Void Shield and the Sinister Energy Cannon. Even if these 2 things were destroyed, if the problem of Pheno City wasn't resolved, new Sinister Energy Cannons and Void Shields would soon be born by Pheno City. But this would take time. Without the protection of the Void Shield and the counterattack of the Sinister Energy Cannon, the Imperial Navy with its hands untied would be able to bring destruction to Pheno City before new Void Shields and Sinister Energy Cannons could emerge. This was Gu Hang's entire plan. Logically, if he personally led the team to destroy the Void Shield and the Sinister Energy Cannon, it would be the fastest. But regrettably, that wasn't possible. If he left now, Ge Wajia would likely immediately discover the anomaly of Pheno City. After all, using the demon sword to seal the 2 realms and prevent the transmission of information was something only he could do. He was already extremely busy. The demons and cultists in this space, with the events happening at the center of Pheno City's nest, should all know what they need to know by now. They continuously tried to pass this information to the subspace. Normally, this would be very simple, just a thought, and Ge Wajia, the lord of this subspace integrated with Pheno City the Great Unclean One, would sense the thoughts of these lesser demons and thus be aware of the situation. What Gu Hang was doing, however, was using the demon sword to intercept all of these thoughts. It was a colossal task, but fortunately, the exit for the information was only at Flesh Mountain Tomlinson, whom Gu Hang had slashed. By blocking here, all information had to pass through him. Merely blocking wasn't enough. Otherwise, if Ge Wajia couldn't receive a single piece of information for half a day and essentially experienced a disconnect, it would certainly become suspicious right away. Therefore, Gu Hang also had to fabricate some thoughts to maintain the appearance of normalcy and deceive Ge Wajia. This part of the work was also very complex and exhausting. The thoughts he wove were extracted and transformed from the intercepted ones he already had. Some parts were illogical, strange, or even incongruent with the actual situation. With such a large quantity to deal with, Gu Hang was no deity, he couldn't perform flawlessly. But the Great Unclean One was not a deity either. Oh, it might be considered as one, but clearly it was far from being omniscient and omnipotent. The great demon couldn't possibly listen attentively to and discern every piece of information at every moment. Plus, whether it was demons or cultists eroded by the whispers of subspace, they all had foggy minds, living in confusion and madness, so it was normal to have strange and illogical content. Gu Hang strived hard to maintain the balance of this place. Eventually, Ge Wajia would find out, he was just delaying the inevitable time as much as he could. This was not easy, and on top of that, there was something constantly disturbing him. That was Tomlinson. It was the flesh mountain that he had flattened with his thunder spear not long ago. Of course, the fellow was still dead. Tomlinson was a powerful sorcerer at his core, and his patron was Ge Wajia, the great demon, possessing a soul that was twisted yet very tenacious. The aberration of his flesh was a mere surface-level effect, caused by subspace erosion. Under Gu Hang's thunder, his physical body was completely destroyed, and his soul was torn into countless fragments. This was certainly death in all senses of the term. But because Gu Hang had taken his place, holding the demon sword and blocking here, Tomlinson's shattered soul fragments could not dissipate and surrounded Gu Hang. Under normal circumstances, Gu Hang could easily dispose of these fragments, but at the moment, most of his energy was focused on intercepting and fabricating information, and he couldn't spare the effort. Fortunately, this influence was not critical. It was just that occasionally, some hallucinations would appear before his eyes. These hallucinations were mostly from the most impressionable experiences in Tomlinson's past life. One scene was of Tomlinson's youth, where he watched his father being beaten to death in the street. That year, there was a problem with the imperial tax to be handed over by Pheno City. The human tax was sufficient but the material tax fell short. Thus, the factories stopped distributing food wages, claiming that they would defer the wages until after the tax was paid. Tomlinson's family, including his father, mother, and his 9-year-old self, along with his 5-year-old sister all working as child laborers, were left without wages. The deferral lasted a month. Living in the lower Nest district of Pheno City, just above the starvation line, if work ceased, people would stop eating. The suspension of a month's wages could lead to death by starvation. Left with no other option, he accompanied his father in an attempt to steal, got caught, and while his father held back the pursuers to let him escape, his father was beaten to death. Hidden in a corner, he deeply etched that scene into his memory. Soon after, his mother also died. She let her children have the food and starved to death herself. The second scene was a naked corpse. That was his younger sister, whom he had raised single-handedly since childhood, who at the age of 17, went against his advice and left with a man from the middle district of the city. A month later, her naked body was dumped on the street. Once the guards identified the body, they informed him to collect her remains. The third scene was his farewell to his family. Chapter 622. That year, Tomlinson was 27 years old when imperial tax was levied upon him. His life had just started to improve, having formed a family with his wife, with a 3-year-old son and a newborn daughter. He was working hard, with a chance for promotion in sight. But the imperial tax was supreme, and he had no choice but to comply. He could only console himself. Having paid the imperial tax, his family could be partially exempt from subsequent taxes. They would also receive a subsidy. The fourth scene depicted him lying in a battlefield hospital. By then, he had become an officer. Drafted by the Imperial Tax, he boarded a starship and was sent to the Golden Pass Star Sector to join a logistics team of slave workers in the Star Realm Army. After 29 years of war, he first earned his stripes on the battlefield, then repeatedly distinguished himself and rose to the rank of officer. At the same time, he had spent half of his life transitioning from a young man to an old one on battlefields against the green Skin Orcs. Compared to the comrades around him who perished and were replaced over and over again, having survived for 29 years, he was considered lucky. But today, his luck had run out, he lost a leg and an arm on the battlefield. But his life was tough enough to be saved back at the battlefield hospital. His achievements and medals afforded him a choice either to settle down in the rearmost areas on New Colony Star for the rest of his life or to return to his hometown. He chose the latter. Traveling on a supply transport ship, he was among the rare few who could return to their hometowns as part of the Imperial Tax. He had many hard-won medals, the most distinguished among them being a Warrior's Medal, which still held much value. Upon his return home, at his request, he was assigned a government position in his hometown of Pheno City. The first thing he did upon his return was to look for his family. This was the fifth scene, still a naked corpse, but just an old photograph. It was his daughter, found dead in the streets at the age of 17, purportedly attacked by thugs, her death bearing an uncanny resemblance to her aunt's. The photo was case information preserved by the police at the time. His eldest son, 22 years into Tomlinson's departure from Karolia, had been drafted for the Imperial Tax and was gone. Just 3 years later, a death notification was sent back home. His wife, worn down by years of toil and the loss of loved ones, succumbed to melancholy 2 years prior. All of this broke him. He had never held any fondness for the so-called empire, his youthful family had been shattered by the Imperial Tax, his own family, too, had been destroyed by it. After joining the military, for a time he believed in the propaganda of the political commissars, the military priests, thinking the Emperor supreme, a protector of humanity, believing he was fighting for the empire, for all of humankind, for a higher purpose, a greater good, sacrificing his life without regret or resentment. But upon returning to his hometown, the disillusionment was so profound he couldn't move past it. And so came the sixth scene, he shattered his warrior's medal with relentless force. It was from this moment that he began to hear the tender call of the Heavenly Father. The lies of the false emperor, the rotten and filthy system of the empire, made him sick to his stomach. He wholly devoted himself to the Divine Father, secretly preaching as a low-level official, and established the Eternal Life sect. He sincerely believed that Karolia needed change, that things could not go on like this, that the common people would never have peace. He also sincerely believed that eradicating the false emperor's faith, dissolving the empire's governing system, and leading everyone into the warm, immortal embrace of the Father was a beautiful endeavor. He tirelessly advanced this cause for 50 years. Now, at last, his efforts were about to bear fruit. But then he encountered Gu Hang, the Terminator. Tomlinson's life did seem quite tragic. But in this situation, Gu Hang was heart of stone. No matter how many illusions flickered before him, his attitude did not change in the slightest. First of all, Tomlinson's experience, while horrible, wasn't unique or representative of Karolia. Not because it wasn't tragic enough, but rather because he was quite lucky, comparatively. Both parents dead, a sister brutally killed tragic, yes, but many on Karolia have experienced this and worse. Moreover, most of them never reach the stage of marriage, having children, promotions, and pay raises that he did. The population drafted as Imperial Tax, 99.99% never make it back alive. Not only did he survive 29 years of war, making it to officer rank, but he also lived to retire and return home. His luck could be considered staggeringly good. His wife lived past 50, well beyond Karolia's average life expectancy of 36, his daughter's death was unquestionable, his son drafted as Imperial Tax. Karolia had about 700 to 800 million people taken every 2 years, so that was no surprise. If even he could claim tragedy, then no one on Karolia was free from it. But then again, if someone who was considered very lucky ended up like this, what about those whose luck was just average? No wonder the Eternal Life sect grew in strength, no wonder every nest capital on Karolia, with its bottom nest districts, experienced periodic mass riots and rapid spread of plagues. If Gu Hang had been born into such an environment, his mind would certainly be filled with thoughts of rebellion. Individual tragedies are moving, but for a ruler like Gu Hang, he could see that what they reflected was a systemic issue. Chapter 623. He would solve the predicament on Karolia, which might be an even more arduous task than the current war, but he was confident. He had a whole set of solutions, but everything had to wait until the demon invasion disaster on Karolia was largely stabilized before implementation. First, ensure that the entire planet does not become a demon pit and that billions of people aren't turned into zombies, walking corpses. Only then could they consider next steps. As for Tomlinson's soul fragments, the many illusions that sprung up before Gu Hang's eyes, he regarded them as nothing more than the nonsensical babbling of a madman crushed by reality. Gu Hang would not let these images hinder his mission to save Karolia. He had no time to deal with these illusions, nor did he need to. He simply watched indifferently, his mind not focused on them at all, wholeheartedly blocking the transmission of information and weaving false information to deceive Ge Wajia. But, it seemed Ge Wajia had begun to suspect something. "We've lost 7 warriors and have completed the task of attracting the defending army," Lacroix's voice transmitted to Madan's ears through an encrypted and reliable communication. Soon after, Mrs. Georgette also sent her message. "My sisters and I are now in position." "Good," Madan's replied to each, then took a deep breath and ordered, "Charge." Behind him, 3 Warhound-class Titans, spaced a certain distance apart from each other, broke their silence and began to run full speed ahead. The 15-meter-tall Warhounds nearly touched the top of the flesh and blood nest with their heads. 9 night mechas followed closely behind. Around these colossal figures, hundreds of elite warriors from Phoenix, Saint Cythaire Lily, and Fang Camp, were scattered among them. In front of them was a wall of flesh. The bombs, already installed on it, blew open the wall. Amid the flying flesh, 3 Titans charged through. The minor remnants of the wall could not stop the Titans' impact, leaving 3 large holes. And behind this wall, there was a large number of demons. Their attention was almost completely occupied by the targets they were fiercely engaged with in front of them. The sudden attack from behind caught them off guard. Many demons turned around only to be aghast. The demons were afraid too. Mindless plague-stitched corpses and rotting behemoths were just stunned for a moment. Why was the back wall broken? What were these 3 iron bumps bigger than themselves that had broken in? And those with a bit more intelligence, such as the carriers of plague wizards, were terrified. They knew they were in mortal peril. But what could they do? Just wait to die. The Titans began to fire. Their shoulder-mounted Hellfire missile nests launched a half-volley of missiles in an instant. 18 Hellfire missiles covered a large area in front of them. The high-yield Hellfire missiles had extremely destructive power. Their effect was so exaggerated that all targets within the central blast area would be destroyed by the shockwave and the high temperature and pressure. Furthermore, with the explosion, thermite powder scattered and burned violently, burning huge holes in any substance it touched, even if it was just a bit. For human-sized beings, they would be burned away, even for the rotting behemoths and plague giant toads. If tainted too much, their bodies would melt everywhere. With their powerful vitality, they might not be burned to death instantly, but the thermite dust, with no open flames yet capable of emitting very high temperatures, acted like miniature thermite bombs and would eventually burn them entirely. In this area, 18 Hellfire missiles created a hellish scene. And the 3 Warhounds were not so easily appeased. Aside from the rear missile nests, each side of the Warhound's waist, or rather the sides of the head, also had main guns. One was a thermite cannon, and the other, a kinetic cannon. The 3 Titans maintained their advance while keeping up the rhythm of their firing. Whether it was a large caliber kinetic cannon or the thermite cannon, they took aim and the large monsters around the edge of the previous Hellfire missile bombardment area began to suffer one by one. They were simply dying in different ways. Those hit by the kinetic cannon became shrapnel, while those hit by the thermite cannon melted into a flow of glowing red remains that eventually cooled to black and grey. The sudden attack from behind, seizing the initiative, and the full firepower of 3 Titans quickly disintegrated these demons' ability to resist. Then, through the large holes made by the Titans' entry, 9 night mechas and more elite infantry units rushed in. The 8-meter-tall night mechas, while not as powerfully armed as the Titans, were still formidable. Even the bombs guns in the hands of Phoenix and Fang warriors could inflict devastating damage on some of the regular-sized beasts. The most up-to-date novellas are published on Fruitnoelo. They chased down the demons in front of them, pursuing and striking relentlessly. On the other side, the group of several dozen led by Lacroix, who had drawn the enemy's attention, also launched an attack. The remaining demons, who had lost their combat formation and will to fight, began to collapse. Human troops herded the demons toward their ultimate target location, that was, the demon engine that supported the existence of the Void Shield. Chapter 624. Everything was going so smoothly that Maddens even felt there was no need to arrange for Mrs. Georgette to lead an additional squad as a backup. The frontal attack was about to break through, and the demon engine was within reach. Once it fell within their firing range, a barrage of firepower from the 3 titans with their heavy cannons would be enough to cripple it, and 2 more rounds would render it beyond repair. The Void Shield generator couldn't conjure a shield to protect itself, and under normal circumstances, there was no need to. In fact, they had now arrived. It was a closed space, surrounded by walls of flesh. But inside, a continual stream of monsters kept spilling out as if squeezed from the flesh itself. The demons they had previously routed were also regrouping in this place. These chaotic creatures were certainly not the type to maintain order. A demon army would always experience similar situations, scattering while being attacked, with some fleeing and others mindlessly rushing into combat. To organize them required the presence of an individual with sufficient strength. Now, it seemed such an individual was present. Madden saw a monster about 2.5 meters tall, oozing pus, shouting something. The surrounding demons clearly feared it and dared not disobey its orders. The monsters that emerged from the flesh walls behind it were without question all following its commands. It was a leader. Having made this judgment, Madden sprung into action. He raised his left arm, and the heavy explosive round minigun unleashed a metal storm at the head monster. At the same time, his command reached several night mechas. Their cannon fire, along with Madden's gunfire, covered the area. The 3 Warhound Titans continued to advance as planned, with one casually firing a meltagun shot at that spot. This was a deluge of overwhelming firepower, nothing should be able. Hey! Amidst the carnage, a yellow-green figure dashed out at high speed. It was that very monster. And now, in its hand, it held a rust-covered greatsword. Maddens immediately sensed trouble. He realized what it was: a chaotic vanguard. A powerful demon evolved through the immense grace of the evil god. It was said that one more level of growth would transform it into a great demon, a plague great demon, the embodiment of filth. This grade of monster had one prominent feature: distortion of laws. In places dominated by subspace forces, powerful demons like this had a special ability. Under its will, physics, science, and even sanity and thought, would be twisted. It would ignore the force of technology, the damage of physics. Bullets, artillery fire, while not entirely useless, would see their damage significantly reduced. Only 2 things could truly deal a fatal blow to it. The first was spiritual energy. But the governor wasn't here. The second was willpower. And the embodiment of that was melee combat. With swords and heavy punches charged with the warrior's fiery will, defeating it could kill it. Otherwise, it would become a terrifying killing machine, unstoppable by anyone. The Warhound Titan closest to it didn't understand this. The secondary cannon on its arm fired fiercely at the little monster daring to charge at it, instantly tearing the air with a metal storm. However, the chaotic vanguard's stride only paused briefly. The large caliber autocannon, which should have blown a creature of its size to smithereens, felt like tickling, not to mention most of the ammunition was deflected by some strange force, missing the target entirely. Meanwhile, the plague vanguard had already reached the feet of the Titan. The Warhound Titan's energy shield flickered slightly before letting the vanguard through. The controllers of the Warhound Titan were feeling the ominous signs. The massive war machine bent down, sweeping with a heavy punch, but the plague vanguard dodged it. Next, its great sword chopped fiercely onto the Titan's ankle. With Maddens' sight, he clearly and distinctly saw the steel at the Titan's ankle, which should have been incredibly tough, quickly develop rust as if it had endured countless years of decay, becoming brittle and weak, and then the great sword cleaved through it. The towering Titan tilted and crashed to the ground with a thunderous sound. Chapter 625. The rapid assault of this plague vanguard was too sudden. Blasted by thermite cannons and numerous large-caliber weapons, even a Lion King tank would crumble. A demonic creature with a fleshy body 2.5 meters tall would be reduced to ash, wouldn't it? No one could have predicted that amid the smoke and dust, this demon would emerge alive. It bore some injuries, especially where the thermite cannon grazed it, causing its body to flame red, yet there was no normal melting effect. And as it ran, the flames seemed to die out. The complete ineffectiveness of the large-caliber machine guns, or their failure to achieve the expected results, was equally unexpected. The entire human troops were in an assault state, with the core of the assault being the Warhound Titans. Not only were they the most critical fire support and offensive core, but they also used energy shields and their own thick armor to attract and block most of the damage for the whole unit. And the Titan targeted by the chaotic vanguard was the one furthest ahead, even a bit isolated. But it was only slight, and of no major concern, as the conventional units being severely battered had no ability to threaten the Titan. Yet, out charged this thing. As soon as they realized something was wrong, the few infantry units behind the Titan started running with all their might. When they sensed that their grenade rifles were unable to pose any real threat to this chaotic vanguard, they even abandoned their weapons and drew their close combat blades, sprinting at full speed. But even so, the two fastest among them could only just reach the scene as the chaotic vanguard cleaved through the Titan's ankle, temporarily robbing it of its mobility. These were two elite soldiers from Fang Camp, both equipped with feedback-type power armor. The pair coordinated perfectly, with chain sword in hand, one on the left and one on the right. They struck at the pus-oozing monster. However, at this moment, this terrible creature once again demonstrated its fearsome combat ability. Having just delivered a full-strength blow, the Plague Vanguard, who should have been in recovery, moved faster than both armored Fang Camp soldiers. Although the Fang Camp's chainsword struck first, in the blink of an eye, the chaotic Vanguard's rusty greatsword struck faster. And it completed a double strike in an extremely short time. In an instant, the rusty greatsword pierced one person's heart, the solid chest armor of their servant god-powered armor was punctured as if it were made of paper. In the next moment, its sword pivoted to pierce the throat of another, precisely finding the gap where the helmet met the chest armor. Two elite Fang Camp warriors clad in feedback-type power armor fell one after the other in an instant. Having done all this, the chaotic vanguard even had the leisure to leap high, avoiding a heavy punch from the Titan. After all, it had only cut through the ankle, destroying its mobility, not the machine itself. Maddens, who was running towards the battlefield, felt his heart shake at the sight. Such an enemy, even he wasn't sure he could defeat. Its swift movements, its freakishly precise swordsmanship, made Maddens sigh in admiration. Reserve great demons are indeed powerful. But even with that realization, Maddens didn't stop for a moment, instead, he sped up even more. At the same time, he saw Priest Rizzo, the veteran of the battle group, carrying the gravity scepter, also rushing forward swiftly. The two old comrades were in sync. Now, only the two of them stepping in stood a chance. Not to defeat, but at least to stop or entangle this chaotic vanguard to create an opportunity for the other units. Faster than them were three new soldiers of the Phoenix. Naturally, they had seen how their two compatriots had died and were aware of how formidable the enemy they were about to face was. After all, although they could defeat Fang Camp soldiers fairly easily, they could never do it like that creature. But they charged without hesitation. If they didn't, the chaotic vanguard and its rusty greatsword would easily dismantle the Titan. They had to intercept. Phoenix was simply not on the same level as Fang Camp. Even though Fang Camp had feedback-type power armor, there was a gap between the performance of Servant God and Majestic. There was also a difference between Fang Camp and Phoenix. Although most of the Phoenix warriors in the battle were considered new recruits by the standards of interstellar warriors, they were T1 grade elites who had come out of Gu Hang's soldier tag system, the highest grade achievable through regular training. They had also undergone gene seed implant surgery, with their superhuman organs fully developed and physically surpassing normal human limits long ago. With these combined factors, the three Phoenix warriors, at the very least, could clearly see the movements of the chaotic vanguard. Though being able to see clearly didn't necessarily mean they could keep up, it was still a breakthrough step. They weren't wholly defenseless. However, they were still somewhat naive. After the chaotic vanguard destroyed another missile nest of the Titan, the three of them arrived and surrounded it, launching a joint attack. Chapter 626. Then, in a split second, one died. The new recruit clearly saw the sword that slashed towards him, extremely fast and precise. He struggled to keep up, trying to block sword with sword. Suddenly, he felt an overwhelming force, stronger than the battle group leaders, a force he had only experienced during training. He staggered backward from the slash, but saw that his opponent was unshaken and immediately followed up with another sword strike. He lifted his chainsaw sword, clenched his teeth, and summoned all his strength, prepared to fight desperately, hoping his two fellow warriors would catch up and relieve some of the pressure. But in the next moment, the enemy suddenly changed tactics, causing his strike to miss entirely. As his strike missed, the Phoenix warrior had only one thought in his heart: damn it! It was also the last thought in his life. He had put all his effort into using his bulkiest shoulder guard, which often served as a shield in tactical maneuvers, to block the sword. But the blade was even faster than he imagined, slipping through the gap where the shoulder guard met his upper arm, piercing his shoulder, severing his scapula, and cutting through his neck vertebra. His body quickly went limp, and apart from blinking, he could do nothing else as his consciousness rapidly dissipated. The last scene he witnessed was his two brothers in arms, roaring as they fought the chaotic vanguard head-on. And these two, their resistance lasted just a bit longer than the brother who was taken down in seconds by the previous moves. They arrived together, at least able to cover for each other. But the key point was that the movements of the chaotic vanguard had become somewhat sluggish, and it occasionally experienced lag. That was Henrik Larsson, the only think tank member of the Phoenix battle group currently on the field. He had unleashed his awakened spiritual energy power onto the body of the chaotic vanguard. It was not enough to harm it, but Larsson was well aware of his own abilities. He was far from the great power the Emperor could wield. In terms of spiritual energy intensity alone, he was on par with the commander of the Storm Mage Corps. Dress AB grade spiritual energy user was his limit. But like willpower, spiritual energy could be fully utilized to great effect. He was very pragmatic, not seeking to deal damage but to obstruct. And it was indeed his spiritual energy power that inflicted the first actual damage on the chaotic vanguard, and quite a serious one at that. The two Phoenix warriors encircling it finally fell one by one as the chaotic vanguard, despite the spiritual energy interference, dealt with them. But, at that moment, a sudden surge of spiritual energy power stopped it for an instant. A titan's heavy punch came crashing down. It had broken free from the spiritual energy control, but could not dodge the fist, taking a solid punch squarely. Then, getting up from the ground, it leapt up and climbed onto the titan, severing its fist as well. At the same time, Maddens and Rizzo finally arrived. Another strong burst of spiritual energy control ensued, but the prepared chaotic vanguard was not frozen in place this time, it was merely slowed down. Its rust-streaked greatsword clashed solidly against Maddens in the Terminator power armor, wielding a power sword. Neither gained the upper hand. Looking at the monster that was only slightly shorter than the Terminator, Maddens could hardly imagine why it contained such immense strength within its body. He could barely match its strength, but the loss of agility in the Terminator power armor was a disadvantage. But he was not a greenhorn of the Phoenix. His exceptional swordsmanship and vast combat experience taught him how to cope with the current situation. Moreover, Priest Rizzo was assisting by his side. And with Larsson stealthily using his spiritual energy to tamper with the monster now and then from a distance, the battle between the two parties was at a stalemate for the moment. Meanwhile, inspired by the rallying call of the chaotic vanguard, the demons regrouped, some opening fire, some charging. But on the human side, the main force wasn't compromised. Although one titan was half disabled, the other two were still active, pouring out intense firepower. 9 night mechas also held their ground on the front line. But because of the presence of the chaotic vanguard, the power that weakened the laws of the physical universe was expanding. The demons charging ahead were not quite like it, almost immune to gunfire and shelling, but they, too, received significant damage reduction. Although most of the monsters fell on the charge, many valiant carriers of Plague, the Forsaken, and Chaos Spawn made it to close quarters. The Phoenix, Battle Nuns, and the Fangs engaged these beasts in hand-to-hand combat. Overall, humanity held the advantage. And the 9 Mecha Knights of the Alliance started to shine. Each was armed with a massive chainsaw sword to match their size, and with firm and reliable ground control, they could freely exhibit knightly swordsmanship. Large creature intruders, such as the rotting flesh beasts, were chopped into pieces after a few cuts by 2 or 3 Mecha Knights. For regular-sized enemies, a sweep of the huge chainsaw swords often obliterated a swath of the enemy. Many demons were destroyed beneath the blades of mankind. The 3 types of elite warriors in powered armor were equally adept with their chainsaw swords and combat blades, their killing efficiency not slower than bullets. However, although they were still efficiently slaughtering the enemies of the Emperor, their formation could no longer advance. The chaotic vanguard was merely held back, tying up the 2 strongest forces on their side, and the entire team was blocked at the front by the huge demon army it had inspired. In the brutal close-quarters combat, no matter how strong the human warriors were, casualties were inevitable. If this battle turned into one of attrition here, the elite but numerically inferior human forces would undoubtedly face defeat. But Maddens had never intended it to be so. He was waiting for something else. And that something happened soon. Not far away, at the location of the demon engine they seemed unlikely to break through, a violent explosion took place. The explosion originated from within, and an internal blast even ripped apart the flesh wall on the outside. The multitude of monsters trying to squeeze out of the flesh wall also vanished in smoke. Then, a group of about 30 battle nuns clad in green and white charged in from the enemy's rear. Against common demons, these fierce women were cutting them down one stroke at a time. Among them, the most dazzling was their leader, Georgette. This battle group leader, wielding a holy golden halberd, moved swiftly, cutting down every creature daring to block her way. At the same time, a pair of faint, unobtrusive but genuinely visible golden wings spread out behind her. Although she could not yet fly, her speed in the melee was incredibly fast. Several Mecha Knights and a Titan opened fierce fire, welcoming the arrival of the Battle Sisters. Without the continuous replenishment of their numbers, the ranks of the demon army thinned and were eventually breached. Upon Georgette's arrival, she joined the siege against the chaotic vanguard without a word, wielding her holy golden halberd. With this strong reinforcement, Madens and Rizzo both felt much relief. In contrast, the chaotic vanguard now seemed clumsy and ineffectual. Not only was it disrupted by Larsen's distant spiritual energy but also, with Georgette's arrival and the illumination of the holy golden light, the evil power that supported its strength was suppressed, leading to a decline in its power and agility. And the one to deliver the final, finishing blow was Prince Eureka. This Mecha Knight pilot, after ending the battle in front of him, came to support. He leaped high into the air, and with the force of his descent, aimed the massive chainsaw sword at the powerful demon, which Madens had chopped one leg off with a powered sword but was still resisting stubbornly. Under this sword strike, the demon, unable to dodge, was torn to pieces by the 6-meter-long giant sword. Chapter 627. Report, General. The void shield over Pheno City has dissipated. Hearing this, Major General Du Shiliang, who was both the captain of the Concerto and acting commander of the Tianma fleet, immediately ordered, "Stop the attack at once." "What? What do you mean what? We have our people inside." "Yes, General." The order to cease fire was given, and the person turned to ask, "When do we attack then?" "According to Commander Gu, we'll attack again tomorrow," replied Major General Du Shiliang. "Yes." After sending the adjutant away, he stood on the bridge, gazing at the planet in front of him. He couldn't help but feel emotional, everything was finally about to come to a conclusion. He still remembered having an argument with Commander Gu. But that had nothing to do with personal grudges, they merely had different views on work, on the mission. He didn't want the Tianma fleet to continue bombarding Karolia's ground forces. In his view, that was meaningless. Unable to defy Gu Hang, who was now the war zone commander, he had no choice but to follow orders. He would carry them out to the letter, and anyone expecting more from him was deluding themselves. However, it wasn't that he didn't care about the situation. If he seemed indifferent, it was mainly because he didn't believe they could win the war by fighting this way. He didn't believe Gu Hang's claim that he could resolve the issue of the void shield over Pheno City so quickly. He was only preparing for the orbital strike as ordered by Gu Hang. When the time came, he would fire the ammunition that needed to be fired and nothing beyond that would be his concern. But what he didn't expect was that Gu Hang actually did it. An A-class spiritual energy user, as well as the elite troops led by Gu Hang from his so-called alliance, possessed such formidable strength. How had they infiltrated the city? How had they shut down the void shield? Du Shiliang didn't have the answers. But it didn't matter. If the void shield was indeed gone, that meant victory in the war was within reach. Naturally, he wouldn't launch an orbital strike now. According to Commander Gu's instructions, they would strike at the earliest tomorrow. He understood that there should be time allotted for the retreat of the elite troops who had infiltrated. Not just the elite troops, but a large number of regular forces within the activated Nest capital also needed time to withdraw. Firing now would be murder. As for whether the void shield was temporarily shut down or truly destroyed, truth be told, Du Shiliang didn't know. But he decided not to seek immediate credit and just follow orders. Commander Gu was a capable man, his orders weren't given blindly. Subsequently, Du Shiliang experienced more changes in the battle situation. The anti-orbit gunfire from the ground had decreased substantially. Those sinister energy cannons, especially the largest ones that posed a serious threat to the fleet, gradually fell silent over the next period of time. Soon, one by one, they were rendered inoperative. This further signified that the situation within Pheno City was improving. Du Shiliang's heart swelled with confidence. Gu Hang's heart was heavy with pressure. Ji Wajia must have noticed. At first, it might have been mere suspicion, only dispatching a single chaotic vanguard. When that being engaged in battle with Mattins and the others, Gu Hang had sensed it. It was the appearance of the chaotic vanguard that made Gu Hang realize Ji Wajia must have become aware. The chaotic vanguard was a reserve great demon. Although advancing to the next level was quite difficult, its status under Ji Wajia's command had to be high, and its numbers were definitely limited. The fact that it had been deployed meant, quite unequivocally, that something significant was afoot. And now, this great demon had been destroyed by Mattins, Rizzo, and Georgette through combined assault. Gu Hang blocked the transmission of the creature's thoughts, as well as the news of its death, and even fabricated false information, attempting to keep Ji Wajia at ease. However, even he knew that deceiving Ji Wajia again would be difficult. Due to the unique nature of the chaotic vanguard, Gu Hang couldn't fabricate a flawless lie, and more crucially, Ji Wajia's level of attention to its nearest and dearest offspring compared to ordinary demons was definitely not on the same level. Under such close scrutiny, the lies woven by Gu Hang were easily punctured. Gu Hang had already sensed the dangerous aura drifting in subspace. He checked on the actions of Mattins and the others. After destroying the demon engine that supported the Wicked Void Shield, they had abandoned the immobilized Warhound Titan. They divided their forces in two, heading to destroy the anti-orbit evil energy cannons. In the time that had passed, of the 9 L-grade sinister energy cannons, 3 had already been destroyed. Along the way, they also took out a few smaller ones. With the core where subspace overlapped with the real world guarded by Tomlinson blocked by Gu Hang, and another important demon engine destroyed, the remaining enemy forces were somewhat in disarray. They broke upon contact and crumbled when charged. In fact, they still had a considerable number left, but firstly, they could no longer receive nearly endless reinforcements, and secondly, once the command system failed, the demons became headless flies, their morale collapsed, and their already low level of organization and discipline became a moot point. That's, in part, why the team of Mattins and others had an easier time destroying other anti-orbit cannons after taking out the demon engine. Chapter 628. The 3 hours they had been allotted were nearly up. After a moment of thought, Gu Hang sent out a message using spiritual energy. Abandon your current targets and head back at full speed. The 2 squads, in the heat of battle, were mowing down the enemy with little resistance. The vital anti-orbit cannons had been destroyed one after the other. But there was no need to worry about the discipline of the troops. Though somewhat confused, since it was Mr. Gu's order, nobody would disobey. Everyone began to retreat. It wasn't until the 2 teams reunited and returned to the central core area that Gu Hang felt his heart finally ease a considerable amount. During this process, Ji Wajia hadn't shown up yet. However, in the subspace, the terrifying turbulence couldn't be ignored anymore and Ji Wajia still hadn't appeared. Taking the opportunity to flee before it arrived was really the best choice. Leaving a third of the manpower and nearly all the spiritual energy users here was precisely to ensure they could escape at any moment. The demons trying to retake this position were held back by the troops. The spiritual energy users maintained the teleportation formation, ready but not activated, in case they needed to start it and escape instantly. That was Gu Hang's requirement. The assault plan had been bold in conception, but extremely cautious in execution. Cautiousness meant safety. The few hundred men present were the elite of the forces Gu Hang had built up over the years. The knights and mecha, along with their self-produced black boxes, totaled just over 20, there were 6 war dogs. Most had been brought here. Not to mention the training of the interstellar warriors, not only consuming blessing points and productivity but also needing time for the growth of the new soldiers' superhuman organs. Bringing over 600, close to 700 people, and now only over 400 returned, the losses were indeed significant. But Gu Hang had no time for sorrow. Troops were raised for 1,000 days, and a sharpened blade was meant to be used at a critical moment. And now was that critical moment. No matter how great the losses, achieving the objective was what mattered most. And now came the last step: safe evacuation. The rearguard was set in place, and they would be the last ones to go back. The others, according to the pre-arranged and rehearsed plan, stepped onto the teleportation formation one by one and were transported away. The last rearguard squad, after tossing all the explosives and temporarily destroying the passageways to repel the enemies at hand, also stepped into the teleportation formation. Leaving didn't require the same caution as sneaking in had. There was neither time nor courage to use the subspace under Gewajia's control for illicit transit any longer. However, the current location, the core area of Pheno City, overlapped with subspace, causing high interference with spiritual energy teleportation. To rip open space and perform long-distance teleportation to leave Pheno City was too risky due to the high chance of getting lost in subspace interference. Getting lost equated to total annihilation. But Gu Heng had a solution. The Storm God Kingdom was an excellent stepping stone, part of subspace and controllable by themselves, providing active support, with the highest safety for spiritual energy teleportation to leap there. After the leap, Gu Heng would tear open a gateway from the Storm God Kingdom to the real world. The required beacons had already been prepared inside Minjian City, ensuring a seamless return from the Storm God Kingdom to the real world. In fact, the entire journey went exactly as Gu Heng had hoped. The terrifying turbulence in the subspace made everyone anxious, but in the end, Gewagia was a step too late. Looking at the sky over Minjian City, Gu Heng felt immensely relieved. Now that they were here, he didn't have to worry about that fatso showing up. A demon of that magnitude could only appear in places where the subspace erosion was particularly severe, like the core area of Pheno City. The marginal areas of Pheno City couldn't sustain its existence, let alone now that they were inside Minjian City. The veil of reality in Karolia hadn't become so fragile yet, so there was no need to worry about that great filth coming here to cause him trouble. Once Gu Heng felt at ease, he let Madans and the team go down to rest, while he himself ascended to the highest point of Minjian City. The view was not bad, but Pheno City, hundreds of kilometers away, was still out of sight. Yet he stood there, gazing in that direction. Meanwhile, he connected with the frontline combat forces communications. After a few words, Gu Heng had a rough understanding of the current frontline situation. Although he and his elite forces had withdrawn, there were still millions of regular troops inside Pheno City. Having suffered heavy casualties, piercing into the city had significantly contributed to disrupting the cohesion between subspace and the real world. Without them, Gu Heng's earlier operation leading troops into the heart of Pheno City would have been much more difficult. Now that their mission in Pheno City was accomplished, there was no need for these regular troops to continue to hold out. An hour ago, a gradual withdrawal of forces from the front line had already begun. They would have a whole day to evacuate from Pheno City. After one day, the orbital bombardment from the Tianma fleet would be launched with full force, aiming at the destruction of an entire nest capital. Though the time was short and the task heavy, it wasn't without good news. The difficulty of withdrawal, compared to a frontal assault and occupying a part of the city, was simply not on the same level. It wasn't just the difference between attack and defense, or retreat, but primarily due to the inexplicable reactions that emerged from the enemy forces 2 to 3 hours ago. Their command system seemed to have malfunctions, and many of their units became disoriented. The assaults on the human-occupied positions slowed, significantly reducing their pressure and allowing them at least to catch a breath. The troops whose defensive pressure had drastically decreased began to withdraw step by step, abandoning the forward positions one by one. The rear positions had to be held for a while, waiting for those in front to retreat before they could start moving back. The entire evacuation operation and plan were relatively orderly. Retreat is not collapse. The greatest difference between the two lies in the organization of the troops. Though the Plague Demon army had suddenly become chaotic, they were still aggressive. Blindly running and losing organization would certainly lead to significant casualties in the pursuing process, and the speed of withdrawal might not even be that fast. Given the current circumstances, the majority of the elite forces should be able to withdraw safely. And after 24 hours, most of the forces should be able to evacuate. And if there really are forces that haven't withdrawn by then, there would be no other choice. Objectively speaking, given a scale of about 1 million people and the enemy entanglement, one day might not be enough to withdraw all the troops in good order. But there was no alternative. By then, any forces that hadn't withdrawn would likely go down with Pheno City. Gu Heng really didn't want to witness that scene, feeling somewhat like he had betrayed his frontline soldiers. But he had to be cold-hearted and make the necessary decisions when needed. After the demon engine in the core beneath Pheno City was destroyed, Gu Heng ensured that it would be impossible to build another demon engine capable of raising a void shield within a day's time in the inner parts of Pheno City. And if given 2 days, that probably still wouldn't happen. But with 3 days, he wasn't sure. Gu Heng wouldn't dare to set the time of the orbital bombardment to a particularly critical point. What if, in order to evacuate a few more regular troops and the time was extended to 2 days, a void shield actually came up? Then the deaths of so many before would have been in vain. The related bombardment orders had been transmitted to the Tianma fleet. The final deadline for evacuation had also been communicated to Li Kexi, the front-line command. The rest was to wait and watch the grand fireworks show of Pheno City. All in all, Gu Heng was in pretty good spirits, as everything was largely within his plan. But just as he was smiling and had time to ask someone to make a cup of hot tea, just as he took the first sip, he suddenly felt a great shock in his heart. He felt a powerful presence had struck a severe blow to his Storm God Kingdom. Chapter 629. The Storm God Kingdom shook violently, and even Gu Heng in the real world could sense it. In the past, such disturbances had occurred before. In the subspace, waves surged, with terrifying forces churning at every moment. Occasionally, undercurrents and waves would impact the Storm God Kingdom, which was quite normal. But the current turmoil wasn't just a simple matter of subspace waves. Gu Heng already had a very bad hunch in his heart, and he desperately hoped it wasn't true. However, when he closed his eyes and sank his spirit into his divine realm, he saw that worst hunch materialize: monsters with antlers on their heads, enormous and bloated bodies, covered in countless pustules, with 3 eyes and long tongues stretching out from their gaping mouths, holding a great demonic sword, were hacking fiercely at the borders of his divine realm. Although concepts like space and distance exist in the subspace, they are very weak. Gu Heng could travel through the subspace with 100 spiritual energy users, and so could Ji Wajia. But Gu Heng didn't expect that this guy could actually track their movements. Whether he was infiltrating or leaving, he had been careful enough to erase his own traces. How could Ji Wajia still follow? Did he have a dog's nose? Gu Heng found that although he had tried to imagine this giant filth's power as formidable as possible in advance, he still somewhat underestimated the opponent in the end. Now the problem was troublesome. There was a clear boundary between the Storm God Kingdom and the regular subspace regions. The Storm God Kingdom was like an inverted mountain with a thick base, floating in the subspace. The solid grey-blue rock surface came abruptly to an end at the edge of the mountain body. An invisible force encompassed the entire area. This was the Storm God Kingdom. Just one step beyond the edge lay a soul sea, colorful, bright, yet twisted. Ji Wajia was there. His great sword struck the border of the divine realm once again. This was only the second strike, but the boundary could no longer hold. With the third strike, Ji Wajia broke through the border of the Storm God Kingdom. A huge hole shattered open, and the great filthy being, carrying the plague divine power, along with the surging subspace waves, burst through the gap. This great filthy being was evidently quite enraged. How could he not be angry? The affairs he caused on Karolia, he had been planning for many, many years. Despite the now overwhelming momentum that seemed about to destroy Karolia, the initial investments were not small. The cult had been cautious and suppressed many times in its early development. Not only was Tomlison beguiled by Ji Wajia, but there were also certainly more than just one Tomlison. Behind one immortal faith that managed to emerge, there were countless similar cult organizations that were annihilated before they could make any waves. Such a long preparation, now finally coming to fruition, and just when everything seemed to be succeeding, such an interruption occurred. How could Ji Wajia not be furious? After much effort and no small sacrifice, he implored the truly great being he worshipped and tracked down the marauder who had destroyed many years of his hard work. And then, he discovered that this fellow was actually the governor of Rage Owl Star. Although the arrangement on Rage Owl Star was a hit or miss affair, losing an incarnation there was still a very irritating matter. Not to mention, the power of that incarnation was somehow used by this little marauder, turning it into a tool to deceive Ji Wajia himself. If not for that, how could this fellow possibly have breezed through the domain he guarded? New hatreds compounded with old, Ji Wajia was incensed. He rampaged within the Storm God Kingdom. With every step he took, his heavy footsteps left behind a footprint filled with pus. The pus boiled at those locations, corroding the rocky surface. He also swung his plague great sword from time to time, hacking wildly at whatever was around him. These seemingly arbitrary actions were actually infusing the plague divine power into this rarely stable region of the subspace. Ji Wajia could feel that this was a territory belonging to a certain subspace inferior god. But what of it? The so-called subspace inferior god, that is a very broad category. The powerful ones, of course, he wouldn't dare provoke, and even some of the more unclean supreme deities above him would feel apprehensive. But the one before him did not fit into this category. At least he was not afraid. He was determined to catch that little pest here, otherwise he wouldn't be able to quell the hatred in his heart. As he advanced, he saw a tower. He headed straight for it. He felt that the core of this area was right there. Even closer, he could feel that the little pest he was searching for was also there. With a wave of his hand, a vicious spell chanted from his lips, and a green wind formed around him, sweeping towards the tower. But at the same time, a storm mixed with thunder and lightning also swept in, confronting his plague wind head-on. Meanwhile, artillery fire rained down from the sky, striking him. He saw many small blue creatures appear before his eyes. Those little things, organized like real-world human armies that he loathed, were attacking him with annoying, tickling assaults. The irritated Gewagia let out a thunderous roar, scattering many of the small creatures. Seeing the pitiful way those little guys died, his mood improved somewhat, and he began to laugh loudly. With his laughter, many more small creatures, under the blow of the green wind, disappeared as if melting away like snow. But his laughter was soon cut off by a bolt of lightning that struck down. It was that pest. He angrily quickened his pace, charging towards the central spire. However, the lightning became more and more dense, and more of the little blue creatures obstructed him. Moments later, from within the storm, emerged a giant war bear whose size matched his own, imbued with the power of lightning, roaring and pouncing towards him. He dealt the foolish bear a sword blow. But it didn't burst as he expected, instead the creature scratched 3 bloody marks on him. The furious Gewagia tried to strike again, but his movements were hindered by the relentless storm. He was entangled. And Guhang at the top of the tower had a grave expression. He waved his arms continuously, mixing his own spiritual energy with the divine power of the Storm God Kingdom, controlling the divine bear that the core of the divine realm had transformed into, summoning the storm, and engaging in a fight to the death with this filthy creature. Chapter 630. Report, General. The scheduled strike time has arrived, please give your instructions. According to the prearranged plan, it has been 1 day since the void shield of Pheno City was breached. The Tianma fleet should now carry out an annihilation-level orbital bombardment of Pheno City. In fact, all the warships were ready for the bombardment, just waiting for Du Shiliang, the acting fleet commander, to give the order. However, the order had not come. Du Shiliang was somewhat hesitant. He paced back and forth, and after his adjutant urged him again, he asked, "Is there still no message from Commander Gu?" "No," the adjutant responded. "We've made contact with the ground. General Han says they are ready for the strike, and 90% of the frontline troops in Pheno City have been evacuated. We can reach the command in Minjian City, but ever since Commander Gu went up to the watchtower at the top of Minjian City, he hasn't moved an inch." According to Dress from the Storm Mage Corps, it seems Commander Gu is engaged in a confrontation with a powerful demon. As the adjutant spoke the latter half of the sentence, his face showed some bewilderment. In truth, he did not understand what Dress had told him, he was merely repeating to Du Shiliang what he'd been told. But Du Shiliang, relatively more experienced and knowledgeable, had a rough idea of Guhang's predicament, though he certainly didn't understand anything about a divine realm, subspace, or grand impurities or such. He could probably grasp that entering Pheno City, destroying the void shield, and then attracting the attention of some powerful demon on the way out, seemed quite normal. Du Shiliang sighed. Commander Gu was truly bearing too much. His attitude toward Guhang had done a complete 180. Why should he oppose the man who could bring victory? He was fixated on making contact with Commander Gu in the hopes of having the commander issue the order, so the fleet could execute it, adding a sense of ceremony to the whole process as a way to show the Tianma fleet's reverence for the brave souls who had previously assaulted Pheno City. Now it seemed impossible. It was a pity, but they couldn't let one mishap hold them back. Fire! Yes, sir. The order was relayed from the bridge of the Concerto to the entire fleet. Currently, among the Tianma fleet, there were 2 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and over 20 escort ships capable of engaging in combat. In total, almost 30 warships gathered in the orbit of Karolia. From the surface, yellow-green sinister energy cannons continued to bombard them. The anti-orbit sinister energy cannons in Pheno City had not been completely cleared out. These sinister energy cannons, hitting against the ship's void shields and energy shields, stirred up waves of disruption. But Du Shiliang no longer cared. In this short span of time, those sinister energy cannons couldn't do much to the fleet. On the other hand, Pheno City on the planetary surface, now unprotected by a void shield, was like a naked little lamb, just waiting to be manhandled at their leisure. 30 ships fired all at once. Of course, those escort ships were basically there to make up the numbers. Their most powerful weapons were Grade S cannons, not particularly powerful. But starting with the destroyers, Grade M cannons appeared, including the heat hammer macro cannon and the meltdown light spear, which were formidable. With such heavy artillery at this grade, they were already capable of dealing a significant blow to the nest capital. Not to mention, on the 2 cruisers, there were a total of 3 Grade L heavy cannons. 2 Wrath of Loyalty macro cannons and 1 Doomsday light spear array. These were absolute heavy hitters, devastating in their destructive effects on the nest capital. These 2 cruisers armed with Grade L giant cannons were the main striking force, the rest were just a bonus. After a volley of fire, half of the anti-orbit sinister energy cannons launching from Pheno City fell silent. Needless to say, they were destroyed in the bombardment. The Navy personnel on dozens of ships were exhilarated. Over the past few years, they had executed countless orbital strikes against Pheno City. Ammunition was lavishly spent, they even suffered the cost of multiple ships being damaged or destroyed, and yet the results had been meager. But today's bombardment was refreshingly straightforward, truly letting them vent their pent-up frustration. So satisfying. Standing on a highland outside Pheno City, Major General Lee Kexi, General Hans, and a group of commanders from the Star Realm Army and the Native Defense Forces gathered here. Below, the war continued. Those forces that were able to retreat had already moved to the rear. The support troops were engaging the enemy forces in pursuit right here. However, the general's gaze was not fixed on the battles on the ground. Down there, although the scale of participation was on the order of millions, countless demons, cultists, and plague-ridden corpses were assaulting the defensive positions of the support troops like mad. Numerous human warriors held their ground, fighting desperately. The battle was fierce, with massive casualties, the scene grand and blood-stirring. But the commanders simply couldn't muster any interest in it. Because they all knew that no matter how grand the blocking battle below was, it had no significance for the overall campaign. What mattered was the outcome of Pheno City. And that outcome was already predetermined. They watched as fire from the sky enveloped Pheno City. Whether it was the smaller fires, or the colossal ones, whether it was the tail-flamed orbital missiles, or the meteor-like solid kinetic cannon shots, or even the extraordinarily thick beams of energy weapons. Each burst of light inflicted a severe blow on the nest capital, which writhed like a living being. The city was collapsing, and with it, the countless filthy and pitiful creatures that dwelled within were being extinguished. One flesh tower after another toppled, one robust building after another crumbled, the wails of the demons, the cultists, the infected, even at a distance of dozens of kilometers away, could be heard so clearly that they shook one's soul. The land forces generals silently witnessed the apocalyptic scene before them. Doom was not an adjective but a bona fide statement. Wasn't this the doom of Pheno City? It's over. Suddenly, someone spoke, uttering such a sentiment. Lee Kexi looked in that direction and noticed it was a native general from Karolia. His eyes brimmed with hot tears. Lee Kexi couldn't fully empathize, but at least he could understand. These locals from Karolia were facing the pressure of their world being destroyed and were fighting this war. They had sacrificed far too many lives in this war. And now, finally seeing the dawn of victory, how could they not be moved? Even Lee Kexi and Hans, who were not natives of Karolia, had been fighting here for many years, and countless direct soldiers under their command had spilled their blood on this alien world. No one wants to fight a war they cannot win. After such immense sacrifices, seeing victory on the horizon, the emotional release and the uplift of their spirits were indescribable. These emotions, combined with the spectacle of the collapse of an entire living nest capital in front of them, deeply touched their hearts. No matter where these people would go in the future, whatever experiences they would have, this scene before their eyes and their current state of mind would never be forgotten. This would be the deepest memory etched in their hearts. However, amidst the tears, Lee Kexi also had a persistent worry. The governor had been sitting motionless in the observation tower of Minjian City, unresponsive, for an entire day. How was he doing? Chapter 631. At this moment, Gu Hang was on the verge of losing consciousness. Within the Storm God Kingdom, he had been locked in a fierce battle with Ge Wajia, the Unclean One, for 2 full days. Fighting until now, he was nearly burnt out. At LV8, which equated to A and grade in spiritual energy strength, amplified by the subspace, he consistently reached S grade. The thunder he summoned wielded earth-shattering power. Being in the Storm God Kingdom, Gu Heng could freely harness the power of this entire piece of subspace. In the essence of a subspace inferior god, he condensed into a storm giant bear, recreating the entire power of the primal fury owl, and it was even mightier than before. After all, how much faith did the primal fury owl have back then, and how many people trusted Mr. Gu now? Meanwhile, there were tens of thousands of valorous spirits safeguarding his side. These spirits, coming from warriors who had fallen on various battlefields of the Alliance. Some of their souls returned to the Golden Throne, but most came to the Storm God Kingdom. The strength of each individual was as insignificant as dust when confronting the Unclean One, but tens of thousands of dust particles were still quite annoying when smeared across one's face. This was the entirety of the power Gu Heng could muster, and within the Storm God Kingdom, it was indeed his home turf. With advantages on all sides, Gu Heng, at the beginning, did manage to suppress the Plague Great Demon. However, suppression was merely suppression. Defeating and even annihilating the Great Demon was not so easy. Over the span of these 2 days, the Unclean One seemed to be passively taking a beating, only able to pound the ground, blow chaotic whines, and howl out its anger, while its body was incessantly riddled with all manners of strikes. But in reality, all the injuries it sustained were very limited. Even those injuries that appeared horrifying were quickly repaired. Conversely, every attack from Ge Wajia, even those seemingly meaningless ground pounds, was essentially inflicting damage on the Storm God Kingdom and caused Gu Heng's heart to lurch. Continuing this way, it wasn't an issue for Ge Wajia to hold out for 2 days, or even 10 more days and a half month. Add latest chapters at Freeognovlo only. But for Gu Heng, to endure beyond 2 days was almost at his limit. By tomorrow, he would definitely be unable to sustain such a mode of battle. Of course, he did have the option to fight more economically. In these 2 days, he had been desperately calling upon all his strength, recklessly consuming spirits, and bearing huge losses just to maintain suppression on Ge Wajia. But if he had chosen a defensive combat method, he wouldn't be nearly as exhausted as he was now. The reason he didn't do so was quite simple: he couldn't win that way. In subspace, where could he expect reinforcements? The only power he could employ was his own. If he only defended, there would inevitably come a day when he couldn't hold out any longer, and Ge Wajia would tear down the entire divine realm. Although he himself could escape, the Storm God Kingdom, standing tall in subspace, often provided Gu Heng with immense help. He didn't want to relinquish this stronghold in subspace. Ge Wajia was an opponent he couldn't defeat by any means, but even under such adverse conditions, Gu Heng still thought of a way to win. Although the risk was somewhat high, he went through with his plan. If he failed to sustain the day-long task of suppressing Ge Wajia, it would all be in vain. But he achieved it. Now it was his turn to win. Gu Heng summoned his remaining energy, fixed his gaze on the formidable monster, and flashed a faint smile. Then, with a wave of his hand, a rift suddenly tore between the subspace and the real world. Ge Wajia paused for a moment, not understanding what this annoying pest was trying to do. But the next moment, it felt an immense repulsion. It was squeezed out of the Storm God Kingdom. And consequently, the body of the Unclean One appeared amidst the already devastated Pheno city. The emergence of the Unclean One brought significant changes to the battlefield. The human army, on the cusp of victory, suddenly began to face immense pressure again. The orbital bombardment of Pheno city had persisted for a full day. Fire rained ceaselessly from the orbit. The cost of orbital bombardment was very high, particularly with heavy artillery like M grade or L grade, where a single shot cost thousands, even tens of thousands, of tax currency. In these 2 days, the ammunition expended on firepower and light spears by the Tianma fleet, when added up, might well have reached the tens of millions, even breaking 1 billion. According to Du Shiliang's estimates, this was almost 80% of their ammunition reserves depleted. Only such a level of assault could ensure that a nest capital of Pheno city's scale was utterly obliterated. Meanwhile, the human ground forces, engaged with the demons that had ventured out of the city in pursuit, experienced a rapid decline in strength shortly after the destruction of Pheno city. Pheno city was the core of overlap between subspace and the real world. Once it was destroyed, particularly as the souls of hundreds of millions, maybe even over 1 billion, were liberated, the overlapped state of subspace and the real world could no longer be sustained and came to a decisive end. Although the signs of erosion would remain for a long time, at least there would be no more evil forces from the realm of the plague continuing to invade Karolia. Chapter 632. These demons, existing by relying on subspace power, naturally began to lose strength and became utterly weak once that foundation was lost. However, when the Gewajia demon lord appeared, these demons suddenly seemed to have been injected with a shot of adrenaline, howling as they regained their full strength. That was a great demon. The land forces generals, who thought they had the victory in hand and were already discussing post-victory arrangements, were caught off guard by this sudden turn of events. Wasn't it supposed to be over once Pheno City was destroyed? Why then, did such an overwhelmingly powerful being appear, causing almost madness with just a glance from dozens of kilometers away, descending into reality? Yet, the Gewajia demon lord, the cause of such excitement among the lesser demons and utter dismay among the human commanders, was feeling extremely uncomfortable at this moment. His arrival in the real world had left him bewildered. My long-awaited descent, he thought, came this easily. Was that little thief actually a good person? But after his descent, he immediately felt that it was completely different from the kind he had wanted. Pheno City had been completely destroyed, a whole day of unimpeded orbital bombardment had turned the activated nest capital to ashes, the power of subspace had faded away, and the curtain of reality once again shrouded this place. The Gewajia Plague Great Demon had no foundation to exist in the real world, the curtain of reality was forcefully pushing him out. Under normal circumstances, he should have been quickly squeezed back into subspace by this curtain of reality. But stubbornly, he couldn't return now. His route back was through the Storm God Kingdom. And Gu Hang was blocking the rift between the Storm God Kingdom and the real world, exerting all his power to push the entity outwards. Now, Gewajia was like a meat patty squeezed between two continuously contracting walls. And, on top of that, the millions of demons outside were draining a vast amount of power from him. Originally, the demons should have been powered indefinitely by subspace, but now he alone was their source. Even as mighty as he was, he could not ignore this level of depletion. But worse still, when he was forced to personally power those demons, every time a demon was destroyed in battle, the corresponding damage would be reflected on his own body. Gewajia already realized something was awry, feeling as though he had fallen into a big pit. However, by then, even if he realized it, there was nothing he could do. Under the compression of the curtain of reality and the Storm God Kingdom, he could hardly mobilize his power and could only rely on his own strength to maintain the integrity of his body, or else he would be crushed. Gu Hang also felt tremendous pressure, even greater than when he had fought against Gewajia. To ensure that Gewajia remained trapped between the cracks of the real world and the Storm God Kingdom, he had to help Gewajia resist the expulsion from the curtain of reality. It was difficult, but he was still trying. Fortunately, he didn't need to persist for too long. In those extremely difficult moments, he still managed to send a message. Soon, Du Shiliang, who had finished the fight in the sky and was ready to head home, received the message. After hesitating for 1 second, Du Shiliang decided to listen to the fleet commander. Although depleting all the reserve ammunition in the fleet was quite dangerous, in the Tianma star sector, there should be no other interstellar forces capable of threatening them. Doing it once shouldn't be too much of a problem. Thus, as fleet commander, his order was conveyed to each starship. Soon, the starships that were still striking, launched another round of attack on Pheno City, which had been bombed into ruins. This time, Gewajia bore the brunt of the bombardment. Just how strong was the Unclean One? Even a shot from a thermal hammer starship cannon, striking his body, had its power diminished due to the distortion of laws, and then only blew a large hole in him. This hole, within a few breaths' time, rapidly healed itself. However, what Gewajia had to face was not just a simple heat hammer. Even though, compared to the massive nest capital, Gewajia's body, no matter how large, was quite insignificant. The sky-falling starship cannons, coming so abruptly and lacking ground guidance, couldn't aim accurately at such a small target for bombing. But all that was needed was to bomb the area, let alone a direct hit. Even a miss, the residual effects of the heavy artillery would still cause damage. Not to mention, there was also a Grade L catastrophic weapon. In the third round of strikes, a Doom Light Spear array hit Gewajia solidly. The Plague Great Demon, already riddled with holes, couldn't hold on any longer. Even the power that had been twisted by laws and weakened, delivered the final fatal blow to it. The powerless and furious Great Demon was eliminated. In his last moment, he was full of anger. He really couldn't accept being tricked by such an insignificant thief. Even facing death, he still had not a trace of fear or dread. As a great demon, how could he be afraid? He was not going to truly die. Neither the body nor the soul was the key to his existence. It was the subspace essence. And subspace essence is eternal and indestructible. Even if his body was killed and his soul annihilated, he would just be expelled back into subspace. Although, after suffering such a severe blow, he would need a long time to recover, one day he was sure to return. Just like the time he was expelled by a starfighter battle group leader with his own life. Wait for it, you insignificant thief, wait for me. Hey? Something's not right. Wajia, returning to his subspace essence, found that the environment he was in seemed to have some problems. Shouldn't he be in the warm garden of the loving Father, regaining consciousness in one of his many steaming cauldrons? He might be utterly ashamed under the disappointed gaze of the loving Father, but he would surely express his loyalty to the loving Father and swear that next time he would definitely spread the glory of the loving Father to more souls in the real universe. But why, upon regaining consciousness, did he see thunderstorms everywhere? Turning his head, he saw a giant. This giant was exactly like the insignificant thief that had tricked him. Within the Storm God Kingdom, Gu Hang, with a splitting headache and although pale-faced, still revealed a satisfied smile. He looked at Wajia, the size of a palm, wrapped in a bubble, wriggling its limbs inside, which looked quite comical, and couldn't help but stretch out his hand to poke the little guy. The raging furious Wajia lunged at his finger with bared fangs and claws, but Gu Hang was quick and didn't let the little fellow bite him. This was the subspace essence stripped of all power, and also what Gu Hang was willing to risk such great danger to obtain. With a wave of his hand, the bubble carrying Wajia's essence flew into the central spire of the Storm God Kingdom. Thunder rained down from the sky, relentlessly pounding. He was attempting to assimilate and devour this piece of subspace essence, with the portion left behind by the primal fury owl. In subspace, power means nothing. The power here is limitless and inexhaustible. But the key is, who is qualified and capable of wielding enough of it? Gu Hang himself could only muster the power level of an A-grade spiritual energy user, boosted by the Divine Realm, it could reach S-grade. The Divine Realm itself could only muster the power of an inferior deity at best, which was even less than a great demon. Now, having devoured the subspace essence of this great demon, the Storm God Kingdom was set to receive a massive enhancement. Both the Divine Realm itself and Gu Hang, as Master of the Divine Realm, would reap countless benefits from this. Chapter 633. The power of subspace is infinite, and subspace is generous. If someone needs the power of subspace, it will give generously without stinginess. But the premise of everything is that this person must be their own person, that is, they must possess the essence of subspace. And the essence of subspace can be understood as a kind of authority. The amount of subspace power one is qualified to mobilize depends on the size of their authority. As for the source of this authority, it varies a great deal. Spiritual energy practitioners do not inherently possess the essence of subspace. Fundamentally, they are uncontrollable channels, breaches through which subspace power leaks into the real world, a disaster for the real world. It wasn't until the Emperor established the spirit network that such power could be controlled. However, native products of subspace are entirely different. They possess the essence of subspace and can mobilize powers belonging to themselves, but it is due to this essence of subspace that they suffer from the rejection of the physical universe, and under normal circumstances, they cannot pass through the veil of reality. Demons, of course, are also native products of subspace, but generally speaking, subspace creatures referred to as demons are specifically known for being born from the will of some grand beings. Even the likes of the great demon are essentially so. The Storm God Kingdom that Gu Hang possesses is a bit different. It does not rely on any grand being, having grown from subspace itself. Its essence comes from the soul sea in subspace, with similar and unified disturbances which later, due to various reasons, became distorted and changed into the form it is now, giving birth to beings like the primal fury owl, an inferior deity. Now, this piece of subspace essence has been grasped by Gu Hang. In this process, the trust of the Alliance citizens in Gu Hang has also caused some ripples in the soul sea of subspace, which ultimately reflected within the Storm God Kingdom, allowing it some growth over these years. But the overall growth has not been substantial. The faith of the 500 million people under the Alliance can only generate limited waves. Moreover, while the population under the Alliance trusts their governor, in religious matters, they largely maintain their faith in the Emperor, and these two things are not inherently contradictory. It just means the growth brought to the Storm God Kingdom is not as exaggerated. Gu Hang has no intention of changing this situation. Why change it? It's nice and cool under a big tree. I am a loyal subject of the Empire. Things are pretty good as they are now. However, since enjoying the benefits within the imperial system, one must also bear the corresponding costs. But Wajia, this great demon, isn't it delivered right to my doorstep? Devouring it would be the equivalent of devouring the part of the subspace essence that Wajia possesses, also obtaining more authority. The size of the Storm God Kingdom could perhaps expand to 2 to 3 times its original size on this occasion. That would be the source of the harvest. But soon, an event directly shattered Gu Hang's illusions. It was as if a bucket of cold water had been poured directly over his head. Out of the blue, he felt a gaze full of benevolence looking toward his divine realm from a distant place. That gaze was impossibly far, as if at the other end of the boundless subspace, but the feeling of being watched was so clear that it was impossible to ignore. Gu Hang shivered involuntarily. It was not that he was scared, but as soon as the gazing eye arrived, his soul perceived a threat, and his divine realm trembled. It felt as if he were witnessing a mountain crumble before his eyes, pressing down on him straight and hard, with no roads to flee, no place to hide. Gu Hang knew what this was. It was the gaze of the compassionate Father. One of the 4 beings in the endless expanse of subspace that absolutely could not be ignored. Only at this moment did Gu Hang realize he had caused trouble. What great is a great demon? Even in the eyes of the compassionate Father, a great demon must definitely count for something. Just vanished out of the blue, even imprisoned within the Storm God Kingdom, it seems somewhat understandable that he would take a look here with some concern. But this glance was somewhat lethal for Gu Hang. Merely being looked at was one thing frightening but not the end. However, being glared at could not be ignored. Who could ignore the message behind it? I, Gu Hang, have been targeted by one of the 4 mighty gods in subspace, the compassionate Father. Even if he himself doesn't come, I'm but a tiny speck, surely not worthy of the compassionate Father's personal intervention, right? But even if he doesn't personally intervene, this problem is quite difficult to overcome. Wouldn't it be normal to send 2 or 3 great demons? Gu Hang was already exhausted, having exhausted all his strength against a single Wajia, and it took some clever tactics to accomplish that. If several of them suddenly arrived, how could he resist? It simply wouldn't be possible to hold off. Thinking of this, Gu Hang's expression became severely grim. But if you ask if he regretted it, there was no regret. How could he possibly let go of Wajia? Compared to the somewhat curious gaze of the compassionate Father, Wajia was an even more immediate challenge. If he let the great demon's subspace essence slip away, in a few years, it would reassemble its soul and body, returning to its peak. Perhaps that so-called peak wasn't enough to cause a stir in the real world, but it would definitely display the power of a great demon in subspace. Chapter 634. By then, filled with towering hatred and having already memorized the unclean members of his Storm God Kingdom, they would surely seek revenge. Moreover, having prepared for it, their next visit would definitely not be a lone arrival. What could Gu Hang use to block them? There was no way to block it. To strike while the enemy is sick and take their life was surely to do so at the moment when Wajia was trapped in the crevice between the reality curtain and the Storm God Kingdom, when his body and soul were buried by the artillery fire, having lost all power and only his subspace essence remained, to thoroughly crush him into dust. That was the most reliable choice. Unfortunately, he had a father backing him up. There was nothing to be done then. It wasn't that Gu Hang hadn't considered this possibility beforehand. It was just that on the one hand, he was clinging to a stroke of luck, and on the other hand, he had no other choice. It was nothing more than releasing him and then waiting for Wajia to recover and annihilate his Storm God Kingdom. Or, be noticed by the fatherly figure now and wait for the fatherly figure to come knocking and annihilate the Storm God Kingdom. Regardless, as soon as such a situation was triggered, the Storm God Kingdom was doomed to be undefendable. With a cold face, Gu Hang had already spun many thoughts in his mind. One after another, contingency plans formed in his head. There were thoughts of resistance and thoughts of cutting losses and seeking survival when the momentum was against him. If the Storm God Kingdom really couldn't be saved, then it would be let go. The subspace essence of the Storm God Kingdom was controlled by Gu Hang, indeed, but it wasn't Gu Hang himself. Destroying it here meant losing a very useful method and trump card, which was quite a pity, but it wouldn't affect his endeavors in the real world. Could the fatherly figure run to the real world and slaughter him? It wouldn't be that easy. It just meant that he would be one method short in the future, unable to use the Storm God Kingdom. It was very unfortunate, crippling even, but it wasn't completely unacceptable. As Gu Hang thought this, suddenly, there was an unexpected change. His vision blurred as if he saw a violent flash of gold. A cold sun seemed to rise in subspace, and bone-chilling winds blew. Following this, Gu Hang seemed to hear an angry roar that shook the entire subspace. It appeared to come from the fatherly figure. But he wasn't curious, he didn't hesitate, and he decisively retracted all his senses. It seemed that something formidable was happening, so it was best to hide far away to avoid getting splashed with blood. But this so-called big event didn't last too long. Soon, when Gu Hang mustered the courage and cautiously extended his senses via the storm god kingdom, he discovered that everything was calm outside. Even, eerily calm. The malicious gaze? Gone. The raging subspace tide? Subsided. The fatherly figure? The fatherly figure was still there, still occupying an important position in the vast, unobservable subspace, but there was no longer any tendency to look in his direction. Gu Hang felt as if a layer of fog had formed around his storm god kingdom, cutting off many gazes. What was going on? Gu Hang had a rough guess in his mind. In subspace, the only one who could be mentioned in the same breath as the four most formidable beings was one other. To humanity, there are 4 evil gods in subspace, to other races, there are 5. But, what have I done to deserve this? Researching those things within the storm god kingdom was meaningless, anyway, he couldn't understand them, so he didn't think much about it. After securing the origin of Ge Wajia at the top of the central spire of the divine realm, constantly subjected to the purifying thunder and unable to escape, Gu Hang's consciousness had left subspace. His spirit had long been on the brink of its limit, but he still persevered and walked out of the observation tower in Minjian City. The secretarial team waiting outside, along with many high-ranking officials, couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief when they finally saw the governor emerge. Fear. After winning a battle, it was the happiest of times, yet the person who led everyone to victory had been silent here for more than 2 days. How could this not cause uneasiness in everyone's hearts? Gu Hang, enduring the feeling of weakness, calmly greeted the people, and then appeared again in the governor's residence of Minjian City, meeting with many officials from the Nest capital government and the Planetary government. Then, inside the governor's residence, he communicated with Major General Du Shiliang of the Tianma fleet, General Hans of the Star Realm Army, and Nell Lavis, a special envoy from the Star Domain government, separately. This communication didn't cover anything important, it was a simple briefing on his current situation and an exchange of news, which marked its end. The purpose of the call was not anything else. Gu Hang needed to make his presence felt, to tell his many partners that he had safely returned. And this message was indeed more uplifting than anything else. The news of victory had thrilled many people, including Nell Lavis. This Star Domain government special envoy and head of taxation, who had undergone multiple life extension surgeries and was over 300 years old, looked at the surface of Corollia planet with a smile. Her chest rose and fell with excitement. Ever since she took on the role of special envoy and came to Corollia, she had been under great pressure. At present, the situation facing the Star Domain government was somewhat shaky. The most significant disaster within the Star Domain, the Iron Teeth Greenskins, had been going mad for 4 years now. Assault after assault originated from the 4 star sectors they had already conquered, constantly expanding outward. The Golden Pass star sector, which had been a bulwark against the Greenskins, was now all in disarray. Many fortress worlds were caught in the crossfire. Countless soldiers from hundreds of worlds within the Star Domain fought against the Greenskins. Within the Dragonhawk Legion, 11 army groups with many subordinate legions fought fiercely with Greenskins on those key battlefronts. Several naval fleets were playing cat and mouse with the raiding fleets of the Greenskins, engaging in naval battles in the Golden Pass Star Sector, Huanghe Star Sector, and Bloodberry Star Sector. Everyone knew that it's best to strike a decisive blow against the Greenskins rather than engage in a war of attrition. But how could the Dragonhawk Star Domain not wish for that? It just wasn't achievable. The high cost of war was starting to overwhelm the Star Domain government. Now was the time when solidarity and contribution of strength were most needed throughout the entire Star Domain. But just at this moment, trouble flared up in the backyard. Corollia 3, this nest capital world, was a vital source of manpower. With an output of 700–800 million people every 2 years, it provided a large number of soldiers, slaves, and colonial residents. The entire Tianma star sector might only have 9 worlds, which is considered few among the major star sectors generally having 15–16 worlds, but it is the core star sector of the Eastern Star Domain. The annual predetermined tax quota reached 100 billion tax currency, the total population of over 600 billion people in the 6-star sectors bordering Tianma, whether in terms of population or tax revenue, were not as much as Tianma's. This place was pivotal. As for Lois personally, she was already tired of her position as head of taxation. And the next step she wanted to take was to become the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Star Domain, which was a position second only to the Star Domain head. Her qualifications were more than enough, her achievements were likewise sufficient. What she lacked was merely an opportunity. Temporarily handing over the work of head of taxation to her deputy and traveling across the Star Domain to collect taxes, Lois taking on the responsibility of the Star Domain special envoy in charge of the plague disaster in the Tianma Star sector was that opportunity. If she managed well, she would rise with the wind, and the position of Minister of Internal Affairs would soon be within reach. The current incumbent had already caused dissatisfaction, she had also received hints from the Star Domain head and had connections in the Space Domain government. But if she did not manage well, head of taxation might be the highest point of her political career. At a loss, choosing to push Gu Heng forward indeed seemed like a desperate move. But now it seemed. My judgment is really good, she couldn't help but smile proudly. Moreover, she had a hunch that Gu Heng would bring her even more surprises in the future. Gu Heng, who was on Lois' mind, was dreaming at the moment. A tall man with long hair wearing a simple robe and a laurel wreath smiled at him. The gold that filled his sight was not glaring, but rather very gentle. Chapter 635. Gu Heng woke up feeling clear-headed and refreshed. A good night's sleep, coupled with what seemed like an added boost from a special power, had eased the previous sense of fatigue. But subjectively, his mental state was a bit muddled. The robust man shrouded in gentle golden light, wearing a laurel crown in the dream, was obvious without saying. But the key question was, why? I'm just a minor governor from a remote cosmos domain, what virtue or ability do I have? I haven't done anything extraordinary. Just saved a few billion people, defeated a great demon, and even attracted the attention of one of the 4 gods, the benevolent Father. You want to send dreams, to enter dreams? Isn't that a bit much, big shot? Gu Heng really couldn't determine if this was a good or bad thing. He even couldn't be sure if this was real or fake. Among those 4 great gods in the subspace, the blue one known as the cunning minister, who loves to use various schemes and illusions, may well be pretending to be someone else. No one can say for sure. But he quickly stopped pondering this matter. No matter if it's good or bad, real or fake, anyway, he received a big help from this. The benevolent Father's scrutiny was blocked, and his divine realm was also moved or hidden by some mighty power. Otherwise, a disaster would have been imminent. Even if the benevolent Father didn't cause him trouble personally, just sending a few great demons his way would be more than he could bear. Just this help alone was like saving his life. Not to mention, after hiding it, he could peacefully assimilate the subspace essence of the great unclean one, Ge-Wajia, that he had captured. What else was there to say? No matter if the dream visitor was the true emperor or some malevolent being in disguise, Gu Heng couldn't refuse the other's gifts. As for what the future holds, that's a worry for another day. After all, in the dream, the other did not say anything. Recalling the dream, Gu Heng remembered that the emperor only smiled at him and left 3 sentences. You've done well. I hope you can bear greater responsibilities in the future. The toy you have reminds me of something. In Gu Heng's feeling, the dream was very long, and it was precisely because of resting so well in that dream that on reflection, he could only remember these 3 sentences. But the amount of information in these 3 sentences couldn't be overlooked. The first sentence sounded like a compliment, but Gu Heng could more clearly understand that it meant he had caught the attention of this deity. The second sentence sounded like encouragement, but could it also imply that he might soon be arranged by this deity in the future? It is precisely because of these 2 sentences that Gu Heng was filled with apprehension, unsure whether this attention and future arrangements were good or bad. But since he had already decided not to think about this issue, he didn't delve deeper into these 2 sentences. What he was interested in was the 3rd sentence. The toy on you, what does it refer to? Gu Heng didn't think he had anything on him that could be considered quite interesting by such an entity. Except for the system that came with him through the crossing. That the so-called system was visible wasn't too unbelievable. The emperor assuming for now it indeed was the real emperor, why would he find that thing somewhat nostalgic? Could it be that he has seen it before? Or even knows exactly what it is? Gu Heng sat blankly on the bed for a long while before he snapped back to reality. Too few clues, no point in wild guesses. Gu Heng touched his face, feeling invigorated. It was time to focus on his own affairs. Gu Heng opened his little toy. The monthly grant points income had come to over 7,000. This was the fixed income that Rage Owl Star and Hagian Star in the Alliance could provide him for now. Karolia hadn't been included in it yet. Just like when Gu Heng first landed on Rage Owl Star, although in name he was the ruler of Karolia now, he clearly hadn't achieved real governance. The municipal government of Minjian City was just starting to listen to him, and due to the war, Gu Heng could barely recognize all the senior officials. He was relying on his identity as the commander of the war zone and planetary governor to mobilize manpower and resources. However, Gu Heng was quite confident about establishing his rule over Karolia. After the victory of this war, Gu Heng has gained vast prestige in Karolia, in the Tianma star sector, and even throughout the entire star domain. Plus, he was far from being the newcomer who had just arrived at Rage Owl Star, penniless apart from his system. Leveraging existing strength and immense prestige, the process of establishing rule afterward won't be too difficult. It shouldn't be too long before Karolia is recognized by the system and starts providing a fixed grant points income to Gu Heng. And how many grant points can a few billion people provide each month? That's something to look forward to. Since we're talking about grant points, we can't overlook how many grant points Gu Heng currently has in hand. He glanced at the number, which was 1,030,000. And before he woke up, the number was only 100,000. The extra 1,200,000, without a doubt, were the spoils of this victorious war. In fact, the gains from conventional warfare weren't much. The main battlefield was fought by the native troops, the Dragonhawk Legion Star Realm Army, currently not counted as part of his forces. Only the Rage Bear Legion, although not an army of the Alliance, was considered Gu Heng's troop. Chapter 636. Though their combat strength was fierce, and they played a significant role in key moments of some battles, their numbers were still scant after all. The Dragonhawk Legion, which constituted a large portion in terms of numbers, naturally goes without saying, they numbered 20 million and were all classified as allies. Due to their strong comprehensive abilities, they often bore the brunt of many major battles, and the victories they achieved could naturally not be counted towards reward points. The situation with the local forces was somewhat more complicated. In total, they had 50 million people. Of these, 30 million were counted as part of the Allied forces. This was because Gu Heng had not established his rule. However, among them, 20 million were counted as part of Gu Heng's own troops. Because these 20 million people had all been trained under his soldier badge system. Out of these, 10 million were the Salvation Army that Tadeus had established after arriving at Minjian City, newly recruited, issued equipment, and trained by the soldier badge functionality. They certainly counted. The other 10 million were trained on the front lines during the war after Gu Heng directly spent reward points in the trenches to specify a batch of troops to train. They counted as well. Training these 20 million troops cost Gu Heng 200,000 reward points. Gu Heng had always felt that the cost of training ordinary soldiers to T5 grade was trifling, but when the number rose to tens of millions, it became a heavy burden. It was also good foresight on Gu Heng's part that in the past 4 years, he had anticipated a major outbreak in the Karolia campaign and prudently saved some ammunition in advance. In the past 4 years, Gu Heng had obtained a total of about 350,000 reward points, most of which came from his monthly reward income. 4 years ago, his monthly income had already reached over 4,000, and after 4 years of development, it had now reached 7,000. Add to that the ongoing Karolia conflict and the slowly accumulated earnings, that amounted to 350,000. Gu Heng had not made any major expenditures with these reward points. Regular retirements, replenishment of troop strength due to casualties and wounds, the exchange of some buildings, personnel training at Loyal Air Academy, the enlightenment of talents on the hero interface. All in all, around 50,000 points of reward had been spent. The bulk of it had been saved up. And it was good that it had been saved, otherwise if it hadn't been for these 200,000 reward points, the battle on Karolia wouldn't have held up. The local forces of Karolia were still not very effective. Without these 20 million troops trained to T5 grade, the frontline battlefield might well have collapsed. If the Plague Demon Army, emerging from Pheno City, had managed to break the human army's formation on the front line, then there would be no need to discuss anything that followed. In summary, relying solely on these people and the earnings from the settlement of the regular ground warfare results, it would definitely not amount to more than 1 million reward points. After all, the Imperial Navy, which eliminated the most enemies and played the most crucial role, was also part of the Allied forces. Just the ground warfare part didn't merit so many reward points. But it couldn't withstand the fact that he personally led the team, infiltrated the core area of Pheno City, destroyed the Void Shield, demolished a third of the orbital cannons, and subsequently trapped and killed a great demon. Although only 700 people participated in the operation, of which 100 nuns were part of the Allied forces, and ultimately it was an Imperial Navy fleet that bombed the great demon to death, these actions would share some of the reward points income. Even so, everyone had to admit that the main force of this raid was still the elite core force of Gu Hang's command, the Alliance, that had created the opportunity. The system certainly recognized it. As a result, a considerable portion of the victories achieved by the Navy would be credited to the Alliance, eventually resulting in this million reward points income. Looking at the 1,300,000 reward points lying in his account, Gu Hang smiled sincerely. He had never received so many reward points before. Such a substantial amount would greatly help Gu Hang's many plans going forward. Looking ahead, Gu Hang had at least 3 major tasks to accomplish in his plans. The first was war. Although the climax of the war has passed, it isn't completely over. Pheno City may have been destroyed, but the plague demon army that poured out from within Pheno City, as well as its remnants, still exist. A great number of demons have become weak and will continue to weaken over time. However, their weakness does not mean they can be ignored. Moreover, apart from the demons, there are still a significant number of undead and plague wizards within the demon army. Their total number is estimated to be several million. In addition, the plague cult is still active in the bottom nest districts of the various nest capitals. Furthermore, what Gu Hang has to do is not merely to clear out the cult. He completely disdains the way the Corollia planetary government used to rule the world. He will certainly not allow the lower nest district and bottom nest district, which actually have the largest population, to remain in such chaos. Raising people like pigs and allowing chaos to breed is by no means Gu Hang's style. He intends to clean up the lower nest districts and bottom nest districts of dozens of nest capitals on Corollia. Cults, gangs, independent rebel armies, and even some interest groups from the upper districts. All these must be eradicated with military force. Of course, this means that the battles on Corollia are not yet over. Although what's left is just the mopping up work, it's more complicated, more meticulous, and requires more manpower. Gu Hang has included all these within the scope of the war. The second matter is politics. Military clearing is the first step, to completely take control of Corollia and to fully unleash the immense power contained within its population of hundreds of billions. This is why Gu Hang delves into politics. He wants to establish an efficient, reliable administrative system. Military cleaning alone won't suffice. Even if everything is cleaned up, if the politics are not well managed, the house will get dirty again sooner or later. Of course, he understands that managing hundreds of billions of people is not the same as managing the previous population of 500 million within the alliance. But he is not greedy, the so-called efficiency is only relative. At the very least, it has to be more efficient than the original government of Corollia. In relative terms, Gu Hang cares even more about reliability. The training of loyal administrative personnel is of utmost importance. Relying solely on the Loyal Air Academy on Rage Owl Star might not be enough. Gu Hang might need to establish several Loyal Air Academies on Corollia, investing a great deal of effort and gift points to accomplish this. The third matter is development. This is Gu Hang's ultimate goal. Removing obstacles with military force and constructing a high-efficiency, reliable political system are all in service of this purpose. In these matters, an ample supply of gift points will provide Gu Hang with sufficient support. Training more reliable, armies, training more reliable, administrative personnel, extracting more technology and finding industrial development paths suitable for Corollia. Gu Hang still has plenty to keep him busy. But just thinking of the hundreds of billions in the manpower pool makes him giddy with joy. He doesn't ask for much. If he could just develop Corollia to the per capita production levels of Hagian Star, that in itself would be a tremendous wealth. However, before he truly starts tackling the major problems, Gu Hang must ascend to the heavens once more to meet Nell Lavis. This star domain envoy, who pushed him up to the position of Corollia governor, was about to leave. Before she departs, Gu Hang must see her one last time. The many conditions that had been previously agreed upon must be confirmed. The most crucial issue is regarding Corollia's militarization for 6 years, involving more than 20 billion in tax currency. And there are also some minor matters attached, such as the subsequent stationing and assignment of the 3rd Group Army of the Dragonhawk Legion. Chapter 637. Upon boarding Lois's ship, what awaited Gu Heng was a banquet. Dressed in a neat white uniform skirt, Nell Lavis, with her graying hair curled, appeared quite stately yet efficient. Upon seeing Gu Heng enter from the doorway, she smiled and raised her glass to him, and called out to everyone else at the banquet. "Ladies and gentlemen! Ladies and gentlemen! Look! Our protagonist for today has arrived. The hero who saved Karolia, who saved the Tianma Star Sector, is here. I propose that we all, together, raise a toast to our hero." Having said that, she was the first to lead by example, downing her drink in one go. As Lois was the highest-ranking individual present, with her taking the lead, the rest, no matter what they were thinking, had to put on a smile and join in the toast at that moment. After putting down their glasses, people began to applaud as they saw Gu Heng walk into the banquet, being pulled on stage by Lois. Gu Heng made his way through the applause from the assembly of Tianma Star Sector's VIPs and proceeded to the front of the stage. Standing on the stage, surveying the clapping crowd below, and sensing the hidden motives behind their applause and smiles, Gu Heng quickly organized his thoughts about what he was going to say. He raised his hand and gestured downward. Only when the applause subsided did he begin to speak. "The last time I met with everyone here was over 4 months ago. I still remember the atmosphere of that meeting. It was heavy and desperate, and I believe no one could have imagined that 4 months later, we would gather in the same place to raise our glasses in celebration of our victory. It's all because of you," someone shouted from below. Whistles and applause rose in turn, and Gu Heng waited with a smile on his face. When the applause quieted down, he continued. "Indeed, I will not be modest, it is indeed because of me. 4 months ago, I spoke some unpleasant truths here, attacking the policies of the previous 2 governors in Karolia as well as the ongoing struggle between the Fatches family and the Star Sector government. I assertively became the new governor of Karolia and assumed the position of commander of Karolia Battle Zone immediately after its declaration of complete militarization. I promised that I would spare no effort to fight the battle to defend Minjian City and that I would certainly emerge victorious. 4 months have passed, and the victory I promised is now before all of you." As his words reached this point, the crowd was ready to cheer again. It was not that the VIPs present were particularly fond of making noise, but, the incredible feat Gu Heng had accomplished, that turning of the tide, already had formed an overwhelming momentum. If you didn't clap or cheer, did that mean you had objections? Let alone the neutrals, even those who had previously aligned with the Gu clan and the Fufana family, forming the 3rd neutral force within the Tianma Star Sector, and representatives from the parliamentary faction of the Star Sector government as well as those from the Fatches family who had lost the governorship of Karolia, had to clap and cheer regardless of their actual feelings. They had no choice. However, this time, Gu Heng didn't let the cheers arise. He gestured downward with his arms and quickly moved on, speaking rapidly to the latter part of his speech, "But this does not mean the war is over." He set the tone first. The plague cult still festers within Karolia, and if not properly addressed, the disaster brought on by Pheno City could recur. External enemies have never been the most terrifying, the most dreadful enemy always arises from within. As to how Karolia's issues have evolved to this point, I think everyone has their own answer. But for me, the task I need to tackle is to completely eliminate all cult influences during the 6 years of continued militarization in Karolia, to thoroughly clean out every lower nest district and bottom nest district in every nest capital world. I have said that I will establish a complete and efficient administrative system, eradicate the persistent inefficiency and corruption of the Karolia government over the countless past years, and better harness the entire planet's potential. This statement, 4 months later to this day, I still put forth here for all of you to witness. 6 years from now, the Star Sector government, the Star Domain government will see a whole, full of potential, brand new Karolia. That's all I have to say, and now, ladies and gentlemen, you may clap. Gu Heng stepped back with a smile, moving away from the microphone. The audience below still clapped collectively, out of courtesy. But this time, it was much more reserved, and the applause was more polite. Actually, those so-called eradication of cults, elimination of corruption, Karolia full of development potential were very abstract concepts. Which governor wouldn't boast as such upon taking office? Everyone's ears were almost calloused from hearing such things. Just stating goals and talking big, who can't do that? But the key lay in the fact that Gu Heng's words contained a concrete strategy. It was called thoroughly cleaning out the bottom nest district. This was not something one could casually claim. In a nest capital world like Karolia, who didn't know that various terrible chronic diseases lay in the uncontrolled bottom nest districts? And yet, how difficult would it be to clean them out thoroughly? Out of Karolia's 40 billion people, almost 30 billion lived in the bottom nest districts and lower nest districts. With the previous state of the planetary government, it was simply impossible to establish effective administrative management. Chapter 638. All sorts of complicated gangs, interest groups, and rebel armies, various organizations occupy those places, effectively replacing the authority of the planetary government. Their relationship with the planetary government varies, some are in opposition, others have a superior subordinate dynamic, or are either managers or the managed, but whatever the role, there is a certain understanding between them and the government. I respect you, and in consideration of your face, I'll find a way to pay the taxes. Don't meddle in anything else. Of course, the planetary government is ultimately the strongest, uppermost, and most legitimate force on the planet. As for that so-called understanding, it solely depends on whether the planetary government wishes to maintain it. But the reason this understanding exists in the first place is because the planetary government cannot fully manage the lower echelons. Thus, there is space for these interest groups to appear and grow. The planetary government needs them to administer the areas of power vacuum. Without these interest groups, would the planetary government itself go down to collect taxes? In the bottom nest district, where things are a complete mess, collecting taxes is a joke. It's feared that the tax collection convoy would disappear without a trace as soon as it goes down there. Of course, there are some interest groups that mess around or are unreliable in paying taxes, such as the rebel army, often self-styled as the rebel army, the most disobedient group. The radical rebel armies directly oppose taxes altogether, and even the more established ones hold their own territory and population ransom to negotiate with the planetary government, seeking to pay fewer taxes or none at all. Sometimes, the planetary government turns a blind eye, but if things go too far, or if the planetary government is pushed to desperation, the Planetary Defense Army will be mobilized to launch a pacification campaign to deal with the respective interest groups. But pacification requires an army and time. What if, after a long battle, no taxes could be collected? After the interest groups are defeated, who will collect the taxes? Who are those who should pay taxes, where are they, how much can they pay? All this information is unknown, making tax collection extremely difficult. Alternatively, the government could be ruthless, arresting everyone in a pacified area, killing all the resistors, and taking the survivors as a form of human taxation, but this approach is not sustainable. If you handle it this way now, what about next time? You can't afford to cut the grass and remove the roots. Such actions can only be punitive, a warning. Normally, negotiations are held mid-battle, or after the group is defeated, a new interest group is supported to take over, which is a lower cost and easier solution to implement. In Karolia, the ecosystems of each nest capital have been operating like this for hundreds to thousands of years. Karolia had a population of around 40 billion many years ago, and has always maintained a relatively high birth rate. However, due to imperial tax and high mortality rates, the population of Karolia has hardly grown despite the high birth rate, always remaining at its current size. Even this so-called 40 billion people is but a fictitious number. The Karolia planetary government has carried out several world population censuses over the long years, and the data is quite unreliable, with many figures estimated in the end. Anyway, as long as the imperial tax is levied for a population of 40 billion, let's assume there are 40 billion people on Karolia. That's the general situation of this planet. Now, Mr. Gu declares that he wants to thoroughly clean up the entire bottom nest district. Everyone seriously doubts it. If a system is still running, then don't touch it. Otherwise, you won't know how deep the mire is beneath it. One move could cause everything to collapse. They simply can't imagine what kind of changes should be made to the system that has been proven to maintain the operation of Karolia over such a lengthy period, to make it better. Establish a complete government extending to the grassroots level? Do you realize how many administrative personnel that requires? And how to manage these officials? How can the government afford the astronomical costs of so many employees? How many troops are needed to maintain stability during upheaval? Can you afford them? There are 10,000 problems here. If someone had suggested doing this before, they would likely have immediately faced a storm of questions. Even though the planetary governor nominally has complete authority over their own planet, it's just lip service. In places like Rage Owl Star or Hagian Star, where things are a mess, you can do whatever you wish, and no one will care, it's not crucial. But with Karolia, such a crucial location for finance, taxation, and labor export, any disorder would doom everyone. The star sector government would want to interfere, the star domain government would want to get involved, and all stakeholders tied to the population business in Karolia would come out to offer their unsolicited advice. It's only because Gu Hang comes here with a great victory in a world-saving campaign, speaking from here, that he can barely keep these words pressed in people's hearts, preventing them from voicing them openly to him. But in reality, the absence of open dissent does not mean it does not exist. His foes, with mocking smiles on their faces, are clapping hands, but deep down, some may be waiting to see your blunder, and others may even be contemplating what to do next to sabotage your efforts. And some of the intimates were evidently worried. After the reception had ended, Mr. Gu's elderly mother sought him out. You said you're going to clean up every lower nest district and bottom nest district on Karolia planet? You were just speaking metaphorically, right? You're not seriously considering it, are you? Of course, I'm serious, Gu Hang replied, when have I ever been all talk? She furrowed her brows fiercely, how are you going to do it? It's too complicated to explain to you all at once. Just tell me where the money is coming from. Miss Wang Qi asked a critical question, one that, from her perspective as a businesswoman, struck at the heart of the issue. From Karolia, Gu Hang said, with such a vast population resource, why should we worry about not being able to afford it? Are you going to sell people? After selling them all, in the future? No, Gu Hang interrupted his mother, of course not selling people. In fact, I plan to possibly reduce the proportion of the head tax when Karolia pays its taxes in the future. The ideal situation would be to not pay any head tax at all. Then what do you mean by population resources? Gu Hang rolled his eyes, Mother, have you been brainwashed by Karolia's past situation, that when you hear human resources, all you can think of is the price of people themselves? People are the most valuable means of production, the core and the foundation of the labor force. Oh my God! Miss Wang Qi almost screamed, 4 billion people. Do you realize what you are saying? You want to provide 4 billion jobs to make them valuable as a labor force. It's utterly preposterous. Why not? Isn't that the best outcome for Karolia? And the best outcome for the Gu commercial firm would be to become the president of the Empire Commerce Guild. Miss Wang Qi rolled her eyes dramatically, the key is how to achieve it. It's impossible. Then just watch my ability. Miss Wang Qi wanted to ask in more detail, but at that moment, a servant came up to them. Please forgive the intrusion, but Envoy Lois wishes to have a private chat with Mr. Gu alone. That's perfectly fine, said Miss Wang Qi. She tugged at her son and then whispered in his ear, don't mention your crazy plan in front of Lois, you. All right, Mother, I know what I'm doing, don't worry. With that, he turned and followed the servant to a small room at the side of the banquet hall. Lois, dressed in white, was already waiting there. However, her expression didn't look too good, not at all like someone who had just won a great victory. As Gu Hang approached, she blurted out. You're planning to militarize Karolia for 6 years to clean up all nest capitals. Chapter 639. Do you want to transform Karolia battle zone into a 6-year regimen to clean up all of nest capital? Lois's expression was not very good. Gu Hang, smiling, sat across from Lois and said, it's to create a more dynamic, more prosperous Karolia for the Empire. Don't mess things up. Lois's expression did not improve, and she warned, I agreed to give you 6 years to transform the battle zone so that you could clean up the cult and ensure that Karolia could continue to provide labor to the star domain as it has done in the past. These 6 years are not for you to fool around. Don't turn Karolia into a mess and then find yourself unable to pay the taxes after 6 years. Gu Hang knew he needed to put Lois at ease. Lois couldn't remove his position as governor, just as she couldn't dismiss Fatches, but could only pressure the latter to resign on his own and then, through a fast-track process, transfer the governorship to Gu Hang. But that didn't mean Lois, the Star Domain envoy who might soon become the Minister of the Interior for the Star Domain, had no way to deal with him. Besides, Lois was the benefactor who had pushed Gu Hang to the position of Karolia governor, she was one of his own, and he could not afford to push her to the opposing side. After organizing his thoughts, Gu Hang said, Your Excellency Minister, do you still remember the encounter we had 4 years ago, when you came to Tianma Star sector to collect taxes? At that time, you invited me to become the Karolia governor. I'm aware that at that time you valued the influence of the interstellar warrior and the fact that Galaraldo acknowledged my relationship. But besides those, do you remember why you wanted me to take this position as governor? Lois was quite old but still had a sharp mind. She only had to think for a moment, and she accessed that memory from the archives of her mind. She remembered her thoughts at the time, and in addition to what Gu Hang had mentioned, there was another reason. She truly considered Gu Hang to be a promising candidate. Through him, forming alliances and integrating Rage Owl Star and Hagian Star, especially his accomplishment of turning a wasteland world into a thriving place within just a few years, Lois believed he had a rare capability. Having him rule Carolia gave the chance to lift this rotten place out of the mud. With this in mind, Lois's emotions calmed down slightly, and her expression was not as stern as when Gu Hang had first entered the room. She sighed and said, I believe in you, and I support you. But you should also consider the difficulties I face. Gu Hang made a show of all ears. Lois continued, for transforming Carolia into a battle zone for 6 years, I have paid a great price. 40 billion tax currency a year, 240 billion over 6 years, it's a huge number. For Carolia, I had to persuade many people and offend many others to get this done. Gu Hang nodded, indicating he understood. In the next 6 years, if everything in Carolia is calm and peaceful, do you know how much pressure I would endure? How many people would attack my decision, saying that transforming Carolia into a battle zone for such a long time is a colossal waste of the Empire's finances? You won't be comfortable either, not just within your star sector, but throughout the star realm. Countless people are eyeing Carolia as a piece of meat. By that time, whether or not the transformation can last for 6 years is unknown, and it's not something I can promise you now and let you truly rest easy. Gu Hang laughed and said, then shouldn't you be more supportive of my cleaning up all the bottom nest district and lower nest district? Carolia can't stay calm. But I'm more worried about you screwing things up. Lois said, slapping the armrest of her chair, if it were only smooth sailing, the worst we'd face is pressure, and the worst outcome would be Carolia starting to pay taxes a bit sooner. But if during this period, the Star Domain government finds that the situation in Carolia is losing control and might jeopardize future tax payments, then my political career is over, and your life is too. Do you understand? As she spoke, her tone was earnest and concerned. Just sit tight in your position as the Carolia governor, you've already solved the biggest difficulty. Eliminating the cult shouldn't be hard, 6 years is enough time, you could even save up a large fortune. After 6 years, when you can smoothly pay the taxes, you will be one of the most powerful figures in the Tianma star sector. By then, your alliance controls 3 worlds, with your mother managing the Gu commercial firm and being able to mobilize resources from the Empire Commerce Guild. Your fiancé is a naval major general, bound to be the commander of the Tianma fleet in the future. I will help you, Galaraldo will help you, your future is limitless, so why bother stirring up trouble? Lois believed she was completely considering things from Gu Hang's perspective. Even Gu Hang could not deny her standpoint. But Gu Hang sighed in his heart. How could my ambition be satisfied with just this? However, it was difficult to express this aspect to Lois. She would neither understand nor agree. After a moment of thought, Gu Hang sincerely thanked Lois, and then spoke earnestly, I fully appreciate your keen expectations for me and understand the importance of Carolia to the Empire, with its billions of people making extremely significant contributions to the Star Domain's endeavors. But, General Lois, please consider, what is it that the Star Domain government, the Empire, lacks and really needs to get from Carolia? Is it truly the population? Where did these billions of people ultimately go? They were either sent to countless places within the vast star realm of the Empire, becoming slave labor, cannon fodder, or the lower class residents of newly colonized planets. They are simply moving from nest capital on Carolia to another place to live or die. The value they create has not changed at all. I hope to make some changes. The same 4 billion tax currency a year, what if it is 2 destroyers a year? Or 1 cruiser every 4 years, or countless industrial goods, armaments, or what if Carolia could independently support a Star Realm army 10 times larger than the Dragonhawk 3rd Legion? Aren't these all more valuable than Carolia's simple contribution of several 100 million people a year? Lois sighed. She certainly understood that Gu Hang was right. If you could actually create a new cruiser, then what would you need those billions of dry bodies for? But the key is whether it's achievable. However, if it's Gu Hang's words, there might indeed be a possibility. I can't convince you, who would have thought you are now the Carolia governor? Lois sighed, but don't act too recklessly. The Star Domain government will be watching, and if things in Karolia get out of control, I won't be able to protect you, remember that well. Chapter 640. After meeting with Lois, Gu Hang still managed to get what he wanted. Although the Star Domain envoy didn't want Gu Hang to mess around in a general sense, under Gu Hang's insistence, she didn't directly oppose him. And in terms of the actual measures taken, they essentially satisfied all of Gu Hang's requests. The 6-year tax exemption for the militarized zone was reconfirmed unless Gu Hang failed to manage well during these 6 years, causing continuous turmoil in Karolia and showing signs that taxes could not be paid even after 6 years, otherwise, there shouldn't be any problems. And since it was militarization, Gu Hang's position as the commander of the military zone was also retained. However, Tianma fleet was stripped away from the military zone. Gu Hang never had any unrealistic expectations about keeping it, so it was not surprising that it was gone. But the 3rd Group Army of the Dragonhawk Legion would stay in Karolia under the command of Gu Hang, who would still be the military zone commander for 6 more years. This turned the Fatches family upside down. They were, of course, furious. In the last round of struggle, they had secured the position of Karolia governor, hoping they could finally take charge of the Tianma interests and become the master. They did indeed manage to stand on an equal footing with the Star Sector government over the past few years, basking in glory. To secure their position in Karolia, they had invested heavily. And now, it was all for naught. That would have been fine, but now, they had even lost the 3rd Army Group. The Dragonhawk 3rd Corps had always been Fatches' forbidden fruit. For many years, they had borne all costs for the Legion, from personnel to equipment to logistics. Problems in Karolia were nothing new. Though there had been repeated requests to deploy the Star Realm Army, namely the Dragonhawk 3rd Corps, from the Karolia governor to the Star Sector government, and the Star Domain government had approved it time and again, Fatches had created numerous obstacles, and the deployment of troops had been stingy, initially only on the scale of 1 million. This was far less generous than when they had sent people to Rage Owl Star to clean up for Blackbird Heavy Industries. Only after they took over the position of Karolia governor did they spare no effort to commit the Star Realm Army to secure their status. And now, they had lost the position again. All the previous investments in resources and political assets had gone down the drain, but they were willing to take their losses and would find another way. However, they had never intended to give up control over the Dragonhawk Legion. It wasn't easy to speak up before the defense of Minjian City concluded, but now, with Pheno City destroyed, the Fatches family was openly trying to maneuver to get the Dragonhawk Legion recalled. They found a basket full of reasons Fatches' tri-star defenses were weak, the Legion's longing for home, claiming that supply would be more convenient after returning to Fatches' tri-star. But Gu Hang blocked all these reasons. His counter-question was simple: is this the Star Realm Army, or is it your Fatches' private militia? Although Fatches had always treated this force as their private militia, that was obviously not something they could publicize openly. Furthermore, Gu Hang had received support from various parties. The Star Sector government was certainly willing to suppress Fatches, and the Star Domain government, represented by Lois, also intended to punish Fatches. The performance of the Fatches family during their tenure as Karolia governor was nothing short of disastrous. Of course, the Fatches family wouldn't just let things go so easily. In explaining the situation, they mentioned some realities. The vast majority of officers and soldiers in the Dragonhawk 3rd Corps came from the Fatches tri-star. They were homesick and their morale had lowered due to not being able to return home for a long time, and the Fatches family had sufficient ability to influence the internal situation of the Corps. Over time, this would undoubtedly lead to issues within the Corps. The most direct manifestation of this was that although they were currently following Gu Hang's orders, and General Hans, the Corps commander, had also shown compliance with the orders from the Star Realm Army headquarters and the Military Affairs Department by suppressing the emotions within the troops and continuing to execute Mr. Gu's commands, they still had not appeared in the system's soldier tag. This also meant that the system did not recognize them as Gu Hang's troops. However, this did not affect Gu Hang's decision to make use of them for the time being. After the destruction of Pheno City, there was no need to keep so many forces on the battlefield outside Minjian City. The local forces that had undergone training with Gu Hang's soldier tag system numbered 20 million. After the battle, deducting the casualties, missing personnel, and the injured soldiers who were discharged, there were still 17 million left. Thaddeus had recruited another 3 million people from within Minjian City to supplement this force and completely integrated them as the Salvation Army, which was then reassigned back to Minjian City. General Thaddeus temporarily assumed the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Salvation Army, and his first task was to execute the governor's order to completely clear the Lower Nest District and Bottom Nest District of Minjian City and establish military governance. The more than 30 million local defense forces generally returned to their respective nest capitals. The numerous nest capitals on Karolia were in constant turmoil and urgently needed the military to maintain order. The remaining more than 18 million from the Dragonhawk Third Corps stayed near the ruins of Pheno City. There were still several million weakened demons, leaderless cultists, and pestilent walking corpses in the area. Gu Heng's task for General Hans was to have them swiftly eliminate all remaining enemies in the area. Hans spent 3 months to fulfill this mission. Once it was confirmed that most of the enemies had been eliminated, he left several 100,000 troops to monitor and continue clearing the region. The majority of the remaining troops then entered Minjian City and joined the campaign to purge the Bottom Nest District. The military operation itself did not present many difficulties. Gangs, rebel army, cults, interest groups. Could any of these possibly muster an effective resistance against the military's iron fist? But to say it was smooth sailing would not be quite accurate. The military pressure was still quite substantial. This pressure did not stem from the strength of the enemy or the intensity of their resistance, but rather from the fact that maintaining public order was extremely troublesome. According to ancient statistics, Minjian City had a population of 4 billion. Most of them lived in the Lower Nest District and Bottom Nest District. The Lower Nest District was still manageable as it had a certain administrative management system. However, the Bottom Nest District, though not entirely in chaos and disorder, was at the very least not under government control. Gangs and the rebel army would scatter as soon as they were attacked, but after the battle ended and military governance was established, that's when the real trouble started. An endless stream of violent crimes, attacks on patrol teams, night raids, secret preaching and assemblies. Even with the 40 million troops of the Star Realm Army and Salvation Army in Minjian City, they still felt it was not enough.